Hey everyone. Welcome back to No Harry, get ready for an amazing tale. Harry fainted at the Wizengamot Goblins revealed he was sovereign of 24 noble houses. Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Weight of Chains. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry had always thought was the most dishonest day of the week. Mondays were openly awful. Wednesdays had that midweek resignation about them that at least felt honest. But Tuesdays pretended everything was fine, and then something like this showed up between a water bill addressed to Vernon Dursley and a catalogue for garden furniture. He read it twice standing at the bottom of the stairs in his socks, the Dursleys' kitchen smelling of burnt toast and his uncle's aftershave. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease lines, tucked it into the pocket of his jeans, and went back upstairs to sit on the edge of his bed and think. The letter was from the Ministry of Magic, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Office of Wizengamot Administration Services. It informed him, in language so polished it felt like being smiled at by someone who wanted to hit you, that a disciplinary review had been convened regarding his use of underage magic during the summer prior to his 5th year at Hogwarts, the Dementor incident on Magnolia Crescent, and that new procedural questions had been raised regarding the conduct and conclusions of his original hearing. He was required to appear before a full session of the Wizengamot in 3 days. Attendance was not optional. Failure to appear would result in immediate revocation of his wand and expulsion from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry sat on his bed for a long time, staring at the window. Hedwig clicked her beak at him from her cage. "Yeah," he said to her. "I know." He was 17. He'd fought Voldemort 6 times by his own rough count, depending on how you classified some of the encounters. He'd watched people die. He'd held a dying man in a graveyard and promised to bring his body home to his parents. He'd carried Cedric Diggory's body across wet grass while his own leg screamed with pain and Tom Riddle laughed somewhere behind him in the dark. And the Ministry of Magic had convened a disciplinary review. He pulled the letter out again and read the signature at the bottom. Dolores Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, on behalf of the Wizengamot Administration Services, acting under authority of Interim Procedural Code 7B, subsection 12. Harry folded the letter back up and put it in his pocket. Then he went downstairs and ate a piece of toast and didn't say a single word to any of the Dursleys, because there was nothing to say to people who occupied a completely different universe from the one currently collapsing around him. He wrote to Ron and Hermione that night. Hermione's response arrived 6 hours later. Hermione's owl must have flown the whole way without stopping, and it was 4 pages long, dense with legal citations, marginalia about procedural irregularities, and 1 sentence at the very bottom, written in a slightly different ink like she'd added it after, that said, "I should be there with you. Tell Dumbledore." Harry did not tell Dumbledore. He wasn't entirely sure he could explain why, except that something in him had gone very quiet and very clear in a way that it hadn't in a long time, and that clarity told him that Dumbledore had known about the first hearing and had shown up deliberately late and had left Harry to sit in a chair designed for an adult criminal and face an entire room of hostile witches and wizards alone for long enough that the room had its chance to shape him. To remind him what he was, in the Ministry's accounting. A problem to be managed. He wasn't doing that again. Ron's letter arrived the next morning and said, "That's completely mental. Want me to come?" And Harry wrote back, "No. Stay where you are. I'll be fine." He almost believed it when he wrote it. He spent the day before the hearing sitting in Hermione's annotated response and reading every piece of magical law she'd cited, following the threads, pulling on them. He'd never been particularly interested in theory, that had always been Hermione's domain, but he found that when his own skin was in the game, the words stopped being abstract. By evening he had a rough picture of what they were attempting and a very cold feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Interim Procedural Code 7B had been introduced by Fudge's administration 8 months ago. It allowed the Wizengamot to retroactively review any case closed in the previous 3 years if new evidence or procedural questions were raised. The procedural question being raised here, buried in footnote language that most people would never read, was that Harry's original hearing had been presided over by Dumbledore acting as a character witness, and that this represented a conflict of interest that tainted the proceedings. Which was a breathtaking piece of legal creativity, since Dumbledore hadn't been a character witness, he'd been Harry's legal representative, which was a completely different role, one that was explicitly permitted under the original Wizengamot charter. But 7b gave them the mechanism to force a review, and a review meant another hearing, and another hearing meant another room full of people who decided the outcome before they took their seats. The morning of the hearing, Harry put on his best robes, not dress robes, just the cleanest dark ones he had, and ate breakfast and didn't shake. The shakiness was there somewhere underneath, but he'd found that if he breathed carefully and kept his thoughts moving forward rather than sideways, he could keep it from the surface. He took the night bus to London. Stood Ernie Prang's enthusiastic driving without flinching. Walked through the leaky cauldron and through the Diagon Alley entrance and down through London streets to the telephone box entrance of the Ministry of Magic, got his visitor's badge, it said Harry Potter, witness, and he nearly laughed, and rode the lift down to the atrium in silence. The Ministry of Magic's atrium was always a little bit too much. Too much gold, too much marble, too much self-congratulation built into the architecture. The Fountain of Magical Brethren stood in the center, the witch and wizard and centaur and goblin and house elf all in their respective poses of harmonious cooperation, which Harry had always privately thought was the most dishonest piece of public art he'd ever seen. He didn't look at it today. He walked straight to the second bank of lifts, pressed the button for level 10, and descended. The corridors down here were different. The gold stopped. The marble stopped. The lighting went from warm to functional, flat, institutional light that made everyone look slightly unwell. The floors were bare stone. Harry had been here before and it had felt like drowning. Today it just felt like walking. He found courtroom 10 at the end of a long corridor and pushed the door open. The room hit him like a wall. He'd known it would be full. Hermione's letter had warned him that a full Wizengamot session under 7b required a quorum of no less than 47 members. What he hadn't quite anticipated was 47 members all seated in elevated tiers around a room that put the person in the center approximately 3 feet lower than the lowest seat in the gallery, so that you stood in a kind of stone bowl and looked up at a curved wall of faces looking down at you. Harry walked in, let the door close behind him, and took his position in the center. There was no chair this time. He noticed that with a detached sort of clarity. Last time there had been a chair, a large chair with chains on the arms. This time there was just a circle of bare stone floor and 47 witches and wizards arranged above him in tiers, wearing their deep purple robes with the silver W insignia, their expressions ranging from studied neutrality to undisguised hostility. Cornelius Fudge sat in the chief warlock's chair. Harry had a moment of pure, simple disgust at the sight of him, the lime green bowler hat, the wide self-satisfied face, the way he arranged himself in that chair like he'd been born to fill it. Albus Dumbledore's chair. Fudge had forced Dumbledore out of the chief warlock position 7 months ago and was still warm from the victory. Dolores Umbridge sat to his right. Pink cardigan. Bow in her hair. Hands folded in her lap with that particular stillness that very dangerous things sometimes had. She smiled when she saw Harry, a small practiced smile that didn't touch anything above her cheekbones. Harry looked directly at her for 1 second, then looked away. Not out of deference. Out of economy. She wasn't the most important thing in the room. Harry James Potter, Fudge said, projecting his voice in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed the opening. You appear before the Wizengamot today for a disciplinary review convened under Interim Procedural Code 7b, regarding your use of underage magic on the 2nd of August, 2 years prior. Specifically, your casting of the Patronus charm in a Muggle-inhabited area, and the use of the Patronus charm in the presence of Muggle individuals, in violation of the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery and the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy. I know why I'm here, Harry said. His voice came out level and clear in the stone bowl of the room, and he watched several members of the upper tiers shift slightly. They'd expected something different from the opening. Nerves, maybe. Deference. Fudge's prepared script hiccuped visibly. Yes, well. The review, I'm also aware, Harry continued, not raising his voice, just keeping it level and clear, that this hearing is procedurally irregular, since Interim Procedural Code 7b requires that any retroactive review be initiated on the basis of new evidence or a demonstrable procedural flaw in the original proceedings, and I'd be interested to hear which of those you're claiming, since my legal representative at the original hearing was acting in his capacity as a solicitor, not a character witness, which means the conflict of interest argument doesn't actually apply. Silence in the chamber. Real silence, the kind that had weight. Umbridge's smile hadn't moved. That was how you knew she was rattled. Her expressions were practice things, and when something disrupted the script, she held the last expression she'd had rather than generating a new one. Fudge recovered. The procedural basis for this review is a matter for the administration committee, not for the accused. I'm not the accused, Harry said. The original charges resulted in a verdict of not guilty. A verdict that hasn't been overturned, since this is a review and not an appeal, which means the only charges I could face here are procedural ones, not the original substantive charges. Which means what you're actually saying is that my original hearing was conducted improperly, which would mean the result is void, which would mean the charges were never properly dismissed, but to make that argument you'd need to demonstrate that the procedural flaw materially affected the outcome. And since the evidence of two Dementors in a Muggle area in the middle of summer doesn't change regardless of who was acting as my legal representative, I'd say you have a problem. He'd been up until 2 in the morning reading Hermione's citations. He was absolutely certain of about 60% of what he'd just said, reasonably confident about another 20%, and making educated guesses about the rest, but the important thing was that he said all of it with the same tone of calm, unhurried certainty, and in the stone bowl of the room that certainty rang like a bell. Fudge's face had gone a particular shade of red that Harry associated with suppressed fury. Several of the Wizengamot members were murmuring. One elderly witch in the upper tier, he didn't know her name, had a sharp face and white-streaked black hair, was leaning forward with an expression that might have been interest. Then Lucius Malfoy spoke. He was seated third from the left in the middle tier, pale and immaculate in his Wizengamot robes, his silver blonde hair falling smooth over his collar. Harry hadn't noticed him at first, had made himself not look for familiar faces, because looking for enemies was how you forgot to watch everyone else. But Malfoy's voice was very recognizable, that same smooth, unhurried quality that his son had inherited and hadn't yet learned to control. The young Mr. Potter makes an interesting argument, Malfoy said. He didn't raise his hand to speak. He simply spoke, and the room accommodated him the way rooms accommodated people who had spent decades making themselves impossible to ignore. Though one might argue that his familiarity with the procedural code suggests he had significant legal assistance in preparing for this hearing, which raises its own questions about undue influence. Undue influence from reading a law that's publicly available. Harry said. From whatever individual provided you with detailed legal analysis of an interim procedural code that was only finalized 8 months ago, Malfoy said, with a pleasant smile. A 17-year-old student, however gifted, is unlikely to have independently catalogued the relevant case law. My friend Hermione Granger is extremely thorough, Harry said. And she's a teenager too, so I suppose that's inconvenient for your theory. Something shifted in Lucius Malfoy's eyes. It was very small and very quick, not anger, but something that recalibrated. An adjustment. Harry filed it away. The hearing proceeded. Fudge read a formal statement of the procedural objections. Umbridge added 3 separate supporting arguments, each delivered in her soft, girlish voice with its undertow of iron. The Wizengamot members who were in Fudge's pocket, and Harry could identify most of them, had spent the last day trying to learn faces and names from Hermione's notes on current political alignments, asked supportive questions designed to look like neutral inquiry. Harry answered everything. Directly, clearly, without hedging. He didn't apologize for the Patronus. He didn't explain himself the way you explained yourself when you were asking for mercy. He simply stated facts. The Dementors had been present. 2 Dementors, in a Muggle area, in summer. His cousin had been with him. The casting of a Patronus charm in those circumstances was not merely justified but legally protected under Clause 7 of the Code of Conduct for Underaged Wizards, which permitted defensive magic when the threat of death or grievous injury was demonstrably present. He'd been standing in the stone bowl for 40 minutes when it started. It wasn't dramatic, at first. It felt like fatigue, a sudden, bone-deep heaviness that settled over him like a second skin, pressing down on his shoulders and the back of his neck. He'd felt tired before. He'd fought battles while running on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline. This was different. This was internal, like something trying to surface through him, and his body trying to either accommodate it or resist it, and not being sure which. He kept talking. The elderly witch in the upper tier, he'd since caught her name from a nameplate he could barely read, Madame Longbottom, Augusta, was asking a pointed question about the administration's failure to provide Harry with notification of the hearing under standard DMLE protocols, and Harry was mid-answer when the floor tilted. Not literally. He could see it was perfectly flat. But his sense of the room suddenly rearranged itself, the tears rising around him felt enormous, the stone floor felt like it was breathing, and there was a sound building behind his ears that wasn't sound exactly but the memory of sound, or something older than sound, like the world had a frequency he'd never noticed before and his body had started tuning to it without his permission. His scar didn't hurt. That was the strange thing. It wasn't Voldemort. It was something entirely different, something that felt, in a way he couldn't articulate, like it was his. Like it had always been his and had been waiting for a moment when he was too exhausted and too stripped back to keep holding it away. Mr. Potter. Fudge's voice, sharp and suddenly wary. Are you quite? The stone floor came up to meet him. He didn't faint the way people fainted in films, didn't sway gracefully or crumple in stages. One moment he was standing, and the next moment the cold stone was against his cheek and there was a sound like every bell in the ministry ringing at once and then there was nothing. What came after wasn't nothing exactly, but it wasn't waking either. It was a kind of suspended anteroom, warm and very dark and full of a sensation Harry couldn't name, like being held by something vast and patient. He thought, distantly, about the night he'd died in the forest, the King's Cross dream, Dumbledore sitting across from him in a place that was white and clean and impossible. This wasn't that. This was older. This had no architecture and no borrowed metaphors. It was just weight, 24 weights, like 24 hands pressed gently but unmistakably against him from every direction. Not threatening. Not even particularly urgent. Just present. Like they'd been there the whole time and had simply run out of patience. He heard, or dreamed he heard, a voice. Not human, not quite. Something formal and enormously old saying, in a language he somehow understood without recognizing a single word of it, it is time. He came back to consciousness to the sound of argument. That was how he knew he was in the ministry still. Argument was its native language. He was lying on a conjured surface, someone had transfigured a bench for him, he could feel it was slightly the wrong temperature for real wood. There were voices above him, several of them speaking at once, and he sorted them out slowly. Fudge, demanding something. A healer's voice, professional and neutral. Augusta Longbottom, cutting through everyone else with the particular efficiency of someone who had been cutting through everyone else for 40 years. And underneath all of that, another set of voices, low, deliberate, rhythmically formal, that he didn't recognize at all. He opened his eyes. The ceiling of courtroom 10 looked different from the floor. The stonework was older up here, the cuts rougher, predating whatever modernization had been done to the walls and the tiered seating. He lay there for a moment looking at it and let the sounds resolve around him. Then he turned his head and saw the goblins. There were 7 of them, and they had entered courtroom 10 without anyone's permission, which was already an event unprecedented in living memory, and they were standing in a formation that was not aggressive but was very clearly not deferential either. At their front stood the one that was clearly in charge, not because he was largest, since goblins didn't do authority through size, but because of the way the space organized itself around him. He was old. Ancient, maybe. His face was a map of deep lines, his eyes the bright amber of very old bronze, and he wore no Gringotts uniform. He wore something that Harry's brain categorized slowly as ceremonial, dark, structured, heavy with embroidered detail that caught the light differently than ordinary fabric did. He was looking directly at Harry. "You are awake," the goblin said. His voice was extraordinary, low and resonant and carrying no particular effect. A statement, not a question, not a pleasantry. "Yeah," Harry said, and sat up. His head swam briefly and then steadied. He felt, and this was the strange part, better than he had in months. The heaviness was still there but it wasn't oppressive now. It felt like it fit. Like something that had been held at arm's length had finally been allowed to sit down. "The Ministry of Magic has no authority to prevent our presence in this chamber," the goblin said, and this was addressed not to Harry but to the room at large, with a glance at Fudge that had the quality of someone noticing a piece of furniture. "The Treaty of 1752 grants Gringotts Wizarding Bank the right to approach any seated holder of noble house status on matters of inheritance and account without interference from the governing body of the day. The current holder of noble house status to whom we are required to speak is Mr. Harry James Potter. We are speaking to him. You are, as they say, welcome to observe." Fudge's mouth was open. He'd been reaching for words for the last 30 seconds and kept not finding them. "Who are you?" Harry asked. He wasn't asking in the way you asked when you were uncertain. He was asking in the way you asked when you wanted someone to hear their own name out loud. "Ragnarok," the goblin said. "Director of Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Keeper of the Goblin Nation's treaties with the magical governments of Europe. Custodian of 341 years of inherited trust records." A pause. "And the individual responsible for informing you, Mr. Potter, that you have missed 43 appointments with our institution, ignored 17 certified correspondence attempts, and allowed 24 noble and most ancient house accounts to lapse into administrative dormancy under circumstances that are, to put it plainly, not your fault." The chamber was so quiet that Harry could hear the ventilation in the stone walls. 24, he said. 24, Ragnarok confirmed. His eyes held Harry's without effort. "By blood inheritance, by conquest rights, by formal adoption acknowledged in magical law, and by the terms of 3 separate last wills and testaments that were suppressed and never entered into the public record, you are, Mr. Potter, the sovereign lord of 24 noble and most ancient houses, with full voting rights in this chamber representing a block of 31 Wizengamot seats." Somebody in the upper tier made a sound like all the air had left their body. Harry thought it might have been Lucius Malfoy but didn't look. He was looking at Ragnarok. "Suppressed by whom?" he asked. "That," Ragnarok said, "is a discussion for Gringotts. There are documents involved. Signed documents." A very small pause. "Several of them signed by individuals currently seated in this room." This time the noise from the chamber was general, a wave of murmuring that broke against itself and collapsed into furious whispering. Harry heard Fudge say something urgent and low to Umbridge. He heard Umbridge's voice, very soft and very controlled, respond. He stood up. The healer beside him made a concerned sound and reached out, and Harry said, "I'm fine," in a tone that ended the conversation, and stood fully and turned to face the chamber. 47 witches and wizards looked back at him. Some of them were frightened. Some were calculating. He could see the rapid internal arithmetic happening behind their eyes as they worked through what 31 seats meant in a chamber where a simple majority was 24. Some of them, the ones he'd tentatively placed in the honest column based on Hermione's notes, were sitting very still with expressions that he was slowly reading as something close to hope. Fudge had found his voice again. This is highly irregular, and the Wizengamot the Ministry does not simply accept a goblin's declaration that, you don't have to accept it, Harry said. The seats exist whether you acknowledge them or not. The accounts exist. The inheritance documentation exists. He glanced at Ragnarok. It exists, right? In triplicate, Ragnarok said. Under Goblin seal. Challengeable only in Gringotts arbitration court, by a claimant with standing, within 90 days of declaration. His amber eyes moved to Fudge with the particular quality of something very old looking at something very temporary. The Ministry of Magic does not have standing to challenge a goblin inheritance declaration. That is, I believe, covered in the Treaty of 1752. Paragraph 9. Subsection 4. Lucius Malfoy spoke again. He'd recovered faster than Fudge, Harry noted. He was already recalibrated, already smooth. Mr. Director, regardless of the fascinating legal landscape you're painting for us, the governance of the Wizengamot is a matter for the Ministry and the duly elected Chief Warlock, and any questions of seat allocation require a formal review process that, House Potter, Ragnarok said, holds the sovereignty seal. Do you know what a sovereignty seal is, Lord Malfoy? A beat. Lucius kept his expression pleasant. I'm familiar with the historical concept. Then you'll know, Ragnarok said, that a sovereignty seal cannot be procedurally reviewed, delayed, or administratively parked. It is a recognition by the magical itself, not by any government, not by any institution, not by any individual's authority. It predates the Ministry of Magic by approximately 4 centuries. Another very small pause. It predates the Wizengamot by 6. When the magic recognizes a sovereign, we record it. We don't create it. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had a texture. It had the quality of a room full of people realizing that the ground had shifted and that some of them had been standing on the part that moved. What happened to me? Harry asked Ragnarok, quietly enough that it was really just for the two of them. Before, when I collapsed, 24 house bonds activating simultaneously, Ragnarok said. You have been suppressed, Mr. Potter. Magically, legally, and administratively. When that suppression encountered sufficient external pressure, a glance at the chamber, at the arranged tiers of hostile faces, the bonds activated to compensate. Magic protects its sovereign. He paused. You will have a headache for approximately 3 days. That is normal. Right, Harry said. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Fudge, really looked at him, the lime green bowler, the sweating face, the man who had spent 2 years calling Harry a liar and a danger and an attention-seeking child and had built a whole political architecture on the premise that Harry Potter should be small and manageable and afraid. He felt, standing in the stone bowl of courtroom 10 with his robes slightly rumpled from the floor and a goblin king at his back, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt clear. Minister Fudge, Harry said. His voice carried easily in the stone room. I think we should adjourn this hearing. I'm going to be busy. Fudge stared at him. You can't just, I'm not asking, Harry said pleasantly. I'm informing you. You've been conducting a hearing against a sovereign lord of 24 noble houses without acknowledging his status or his seat rights. Madam Longbottom, he glanced up at the sharp-faced witch in the upper tier, can you advise me whether that's a procedural irregularity significant enough to void the proceedings? Augusta Longbottom looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very sharp and very black and there was a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that she was visibly suppressing. Under Charter Provision 12, Section 8, she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had memorized the charter not because they had to but because it was useful, any hearing in which a member of the Wizengamot is present in the capacity of accused without their status being formally recognized constitutes a fundamental procedural breach. Yes, Mr. Potter. The proceedings are void. Wonderful, Harry said. He turned to Ragnarok. Shall we go? Gringotts has a meeting room available, Ragnarok said, as if this had already been arranged. Which, Harry suspected, it had. Harry moved toward the door. He was aware of every pair of eyes in the room tracking him. He was aware of Umbridge's stillness and Fudge's sputtering and the rapid, urgent whispers that had broken out in the middle tiers. He was aware of Lucius Malfoy sitting very still with his hands folded on the rail in front of him, watching Harry's exit with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and completely unreadable. At the door, Harry paused. He turned back. "Oh," he said. "The original hearing. The verdict stands. Just so we're clear." He pushed the door open and walked out, and Ragnarok and the 6 other goblins fell into formation around him with the efficiency of people who had been doing this for centuries, and the door swung shut behind them on the sound of courtroom 10 erupting. The corridor outside was empty and fluorescent lit and smelled of old parchment and stone. Harry walked beside Ragnarok toward the lifts, and his footsteps were steady. "Can I ask you something?" he said, when they were far enough from the courtroom that the sound had dropped to a distant murmur. "You are sovereign," Ragnarok said. "You may ask whatever you choose." "Why now?" Harry said. "Why today? You said I'd missed 43 appointments. If Gringotts knew about all this, why not come sooner?" Ragnarok was quiet for 3 steps. 4. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that wasn't quite emotion but was the architectural space where emotion might live, in a being old enough to have built very careful rooms around such things. "We sent correspondence," he said. "Beginning when you were 11 years old. The correspondence did not reach you. It was intercepted. We pursued legal channels. Those channels were obstructed. By the time we had exhausted the legitimate procedural options available to us, you were in the middle of a war, and approaching a sovereign mid-war to discuss estate planning is not something we do." A pause. "But today, watching the Ministry of Magic attempt to strip a sovereign lord of his wand and his education in open session, using procedural codes designed by people who thought we wouldn't notice, today we decided that waiting for the correct form to be filed was, as you might say, not on." Harry looked at him. Ragnarok looked straight ahead, but there was something in his jaw that was satisfied. "Thank you," Harry said. "Don't thank me," Ragnarok said. "We are not doing this for sentiment. We are doing this because 24 dormant house accounts is an accounting irregularity that offends us deeply, and because certain individuals have been making withdrawals from your vaults for 11 years without authorization, and because the Goblin Nation does not appreciate being made complicit in theft by the failure of a 17-year-old boy to turn up for his appointments." Another pause. "Also, some of us have been following your career with considerable interest." The lift arrived with a cheerful ping that felt genuinely absurd in context. Harry stepped in. The goblins stepped in. The doors closed. "Unauthorized withdrawals," Harry said. "We will discuss it at Gringotts," Ragnarok said firmly. "Preferably with tea. Goblin tea. You'll adapt." "How much?" Harry asked. The lift began to rise. "Mr. Potter," Ragnarok said, with the precise tone of someone selecting their words for maximum effect. "Do you want the figure that will make you angry, or the figure that will make you furious?" Harry stared at the lift doors. "Which one's more accurate?" "The second one." "Then give me the second one." Ragnarok named a number. Harry stood very still while the lift rose through the ministry's levels, the atrium approaching, daylight somewhere above them. He stood still and breathed carefully and looked at the lift doors. "Right," he said, when he was sure his voice would come out the way he wanted it. "Right. Okay." "Indeed," said Ragnarok. They rose into the atrium. The fountain of magical brethren gleamed in the center of the marble floor. Harry walked past it without looking at it and thought about what came next, and the 24 weights inside him that were already beginning, very quietly, to feel like his own. Behind him, somewhere in the belly of the ministry, courtroom 10 was still erupting. Good, Harry thought. Let it. Chapter 2, The Weight of Gold and Blood. Gringotts at 3 in the afternoon had a different quality than Gringotts in the morning. The morning rush, wizards and witches arriving to fund their days, goblins processing the overnight international transfers from Cairo and Singapore and Buenos Aires, had long since cleared. The vast marble hall was quieter, the chandeliers casting their cool light over mostly empty floor space, the few remaining customers clustered at the far tellers with the particular absorbed concentration of people who were pretending not to notice that 7 goblins had just walked in with Harry Potter. They were noticing. Harry kept his eyes forward and followed Ragnarok past the main counter, past the teller's stations, through a door behind the leftmost pillar that Harry had walked past dozens of times without registering it existed. The door was heavy iron, warm to the touch in a way iron shouldn't be, and it swung open on Ragnarok's approach without him touching it. Beyond it was a corridor that had nothing to do with the public face of Gringotts. No marble. No chandeliers. The walls were raw granite shot through with veins of something that glinted faintly copper in the torchlight, and the floor sloped very slightly downward, leading them deeper into the bedrock of London. The air smelled of old stone and something Harry associated, imprecisely, with the smell of very old books, that particular dry richness of things that had been preserved for a very long time. "The meeting rooms are through here," Ragnarok said. "The documentation has already been moved from the archive." "How long have you been planning today?" Harry asked. "Since yesterday morning," Ragnarok said, without breaking stride. "When we received word that Interim Procedural Code 7B had been invoked against you. We had prepared contingencies. We simply required confirmation that the hearing would proceed and that you would attend unrepresented." "You could have warned me." "We could have," Ragnarok agreed pleasantly. "But a warned man in a courtroom behaves differently than an unwatched man in a courtroom. You needed to be yourself, Mr. Potter. Entirely yourself, with no coaching from us. The magic responds to authenticity. The activation of the house bonds, a brief pause, that was not something we could have manufactured. It happened because you were genuinely exhausted, genuinely under pressure, and genuinely unwilling to pretend to be smaller than you are. We needed the room to see that." Harry thought about that. He wasn't sure whether he was annoyed or not. He decided to shelve it. The corridor opened into a room that was, by any standard, extraordinary. It was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that at some point in the distant past had been painted, not with the usual wizarding tendency toward dramatic historical scenes but with something purely geometric, vast interlocking patterns in deep red and gold and a blue so dark it was almost black, the kind of patterns that resolved differently depending on where you stood. The table in the center was a single piece of dark stone, smooth and very old, with 12 chairs around it that were scaled for humans rather than goblins, which suggested the room had been built specifically for these kinds of meetings. The documentation was already on the table. Harry had expected files. What was on the table was more accurately described as an archive, stacked parchment rolls and bound folios and sealed envelopes and, in the center, a carved wooden box about the size of a thick encyclopedia, its surface covered in the same interlocking patterns as the ceiling above. 3 goblins Harry hadn't seen before were already in the room, seated on smaller chairs along the curved wall with ledgers open on their laps. They didn't look up when Harry and Ragnarok entered, which Harry took to mean they were the kind of professionals who were paid specifically to look busy while actually tracking everything. "Sit," Ragnarok said, which was clearly not a suggestion. He took the chair directly across from Harry and folded his hands on the table. "We will begin with the account status, then the inheritance documentation, then the question of unauthorized withdrawals. In that order, because the account status provides the context for the documentation, and the documentation provides the context for the withdrawals, and if we begin with the withdrawals you will be too angry to process the documentation accurately." "That's very considerate," Harry said. "It is practical," Ragnarok said. "I have dealt with heirs receiving bad news for 300 years. The sequencing matters." One of the ledger goblins crossed the room and placed a single sheet of parchment in front of Harry. It was dense with numbers, organized in a table, with house names down the left column and figures across the right. Harry looked at it. He recognized some of the names immediately. Potter. Black, he'd known about the Black inheritance from Sirius, though not the scale of it. Peveril, which sent a small shock through him. Gryffindor, which sent a larger one. Gryffindor, he said. "As in, Godric Gryffindor's line," Ragnarok said. "Extinguished in the direct male line 4 centuries ago. Passed through collateral branches twice, then through the female line, then dormant for 90 years before the magical inheritance recognized your blood claim. You are, by the most complex chain of inheritance we have documented in 3 centuries, the blood heir of the Gryffindor line. A pause. You'll notice it's not the largest account on that sheet. It wasn't. It wasn't even close. Harry read down the column of figures, and by the time he reached the bottom his mental arithmetic had stopped keeping pace with what he was reading, and he just sat for a moment looking at the total at the bottom of the page. That's, he started. In galleons, Ragnarok confirmed. Yes. Before investments. Before the property valuations. Before the seat rights are factored in, since those have a market value that's separate from the liquid assets. That's obscene, Harry said. That's generational wealth, Ragnarok said, with a tone that suggested he found the distinction interesting. 24 noble houses across several centuries of investment, compounding interest, land holdings, and magical contracts. The wizarding world's version of a trust fund, except that these trusts were established in some cases before the Ministry of Magic existed. How much of it should be there? Harry asked, because the number was astonishing, but he'd heard the word withdrawals and he trusted his arithmetic enough to know that the figure on the sheet was what remained, not what there had been. Ragnarok reached forward and placed a second sheet beside the first. This one had 2 columns, current balance and projected balance, undisturbed. The difference between the 2 columns was, in several cases, significant enough to make Harry's jaw tighten. Over 11 years, Ragnarok said, the combined unauthorized withdrawals from your accessible accounts total approximately, he named a figure. Then, with the precision of someone who had been waiting to say this for a very long time, he named who had made them. Harry sat back in his chair. The room was very quiet. The ledger goblins were still writing in their books. The torchlight moved on the patterned ceiling. Dumbledore, Harry said. The name came out flat. Not a question. As your magical guardian, Albus Dumbledore was granted administrative access to the Potter Vault when you were 15 months old, Ragnarok said. That access was intended for emergency maintenance costs associated with properties under his custodial management. It was not intended to authorize the level of withdrawal that took place. Particularly not over 11 consecutive years. What was it used for? We don't know where the money went, Ragnarok said. We know it left the vault. What he did with it is between him and his conscience. A short pause. If he has one. We try not to have opinions about clients. What about the letters? Harry said. The correspondence you said was intercepted. Who intercepted it? Ragnarok opened the carved wooden box. Inside, in neat rows, were sealed envelopes. Dozens of them. Each one addressed in Gringotts formal script to Harry James Potter, and each one marked across the front with a stamp in red ink that said returned, Guardian Intercept, Authorization, APWBD. Harry looked at the stack of envelopes. He thought about 11 years old, arriving at Hogwarts with no knowledge of his inheritance, no knowledge of his houses, no knowledge that there were accounts in his name full of more money than he could sensibly spend in 3 lifetimes. He thought about the Dursleys' house. His cupboard. The hand-me-down clothes. The careful, managed smallness of everything. He redirected my mail, Harry said. Not loudly. Not with any particular heat in it. Just as a fact, the way you said a fact when you were incorporating it and needed to hear it in your own voice to make sure it was real. For 11 years, Ragnarok said. Not just the financial correspondence. Our records show that letters from several other parties, we cannot identify all of them without the originals, but the interception log is comprehensive, were similarly redirected through the Guardian Intercept mechanism. Harry thought about every letter he'd never received. From people he'd never known, perhaps. From relatives he hadn't known existed. From institutions like this one, trying to tell him what he was, what he had, who he could be if he'd only known where to stand. He made a conscious decision not to be crushed by it. That choice took about 4 seconds of internal effort, and then it was made and he moved on, because there was too much in front of him to spend time looking backward at things he couldn't change. The inheritance documentation, he said. Show me. Ragnar reached for the first of the bound folios. They spent 2 hours going through it. The story that emerged was not a simple one. Some of the inheritances were straightforward: the Potters, the Blacks, the Peverils, blood claims, direct and documented, undeniable. Others were the result of conquest rights, houses whose last male heirs had been killed by Voldemort, whose seat rights had passed automatically to the person who had defeated him, which under a wizarding law that predated parliamentary democracy by several centuries, was Harry. Still others were the result of formal adoption acknowledgments buried in wills, most notably the will of Sirius Black, which had been suppressed by the Ministry on the grounds that Sirius was a convicted criminal, a suppression that was legally questionable since Sirius had never actually been given a trial. "Can we challenge that?" Harry asked. "The suppression of the will?" "All of it. The conviction. The will. Everything." Harry was reading a page of the Black estate documentation and his voice was steady. "Sirius was never tried. He was sent to Azkaban without a trial, which should make the conviction void, which means the criminal status is void, which means suppressing his will on criminal grounds has no legal basis." Ragnar looked at him with an expression that Harry was slowly learning to identify as approval, which on Ragnar's face mostly looked like the absence of the slight skepticism that was his default. "That is correct," he said. "We have prepared a submission to the Wizengamot on exactly that basis. But it requires a claimant with standing to file it." "I have standing," Harry said. "I'm named in the will." "File it." "There is the matter of timing," Ragnar said. "Filing immediately, today, while the Wizengamot is still," he chose the word with precision, processing what occurred in courtroom 10, "would be strategically effective. Then file it today. We will need your formal authorization. In writing. Signed and sealed." Harry pulled a quill from the cup of writing implements that had been placed at his elbow at some point without him noticing. "Show me where." While he signed the documents, there were several, each requiring not just a signature but a press of his right palm against a goblin seal medallion that flared warm when it read his blood. The picture of what had been done to him assembled itself with the methodical clarity of a thing that had always been there, just waiting to be seen. Someone had needed Harry Potter to be small. Not powerless, a powerless Harry couldn't fight Voldemort, and that fight served certain interests. But not powerful in the world. Not politically powerful, not financially powerful, not positioned to sit in the Wizengamot and vote and speak and change things. A Harry who knew his inheritance at 11 would have had resources and information and choices. A Harry who knew his house status at 14 would have had legal standing and access and allies the system couldn't easily manage. The version of Harry that had been produced instead was brilliant in crisis, reckless in opposition, and completely isolated from every structural mechanism that might have let him build something lasting. That had been the design. He could see it very clearly now, sitting in Gringotts' deep meeting room with 24 sets of documents spread in front of him, and the seeing of it was useful. It was fuel. He signed the last document and put the quill down. "The Wizengamot seats," he said. 31, you said. "How quickly can I claim them?" "The declaration was made today in open session," Ragnar said. "Under the Treaty of 1752, the seats are active from the moment of declaration. You can vote tomorrow if you choose." "What's on the agenda?" One of the Ledger Goblins spoke for the first time. His voice was younger than Ragnar's but had the same formal precision. "The Wizengamot has a scheduled session in 4 days. The primary agenda item is a vote on the Magical Creatures Registration and Control Amendment, which would significantly restrict the rights of several non-human magical species. There is also a secondary vote on the proposed expansion of the Ministry's emergency detention powers." A pause. "Both votes, under the current seat distribution, are projected to pass." Harry looked at Ragnar. Ragnar looked back. "Not anymore, they're not," Harry said. There was a sound at the door, a discreet knock, the kind that was actually discreet rather than performatively so. One of the goblins from the corridor opened it, and a young which Harry didn't recognize leaned in and murmured something in Ragnar's ear. Ragnock listened without expression and then said something back in gobbledygook that was short and categorical. "We have visitors," Ragnock said to Harry. The outer hall. Two individuals who arrived separately, approximately 10 minutes apart, and have been waiting with, I am told, varying degrees of patience. Harry had a very good guess. "What are their names?" Ragnock's mouth curved very slightly at the corner. "A Miss Hermione Granger. And a Mr. Ronald Weasley." Harry closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them he was smiling, which felt strange on his face but real. "I told Ron to stay home." Apparently he reconsidered. "Yeah," Harry said. "He does that." Ragnock gave a short instruction in gobbledygook and within 2 minutes Hermione and Ron were through the door and the atmosphere of the meeting room changed the way it always did when those two walked into a space. It got warmer and louder and more human, and Harry felt something in his chest that had been very tight for several hours release by about 50%. Hermione had clearly been crying, which was alarming, except that her eyes were dry now and her expression was the one she wore after she'd cried and then made a series of very firm decisions. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder that was absolutely packed with parchment, because of course she did, she'd been doing research since his letter last night and hadn't stopped. Ron was still in what appeared to be Weasley home clothes, a worn Chudley Cannon's shirt and jeans, which meant he'd left in a hurry. His ears were red. He looked at the table covered in Gringotts documentation and then at Harry and then back at the table. "Mental," he said. "I told Mum I was going to Fred and George's. She'll know I'm lying in about 2 hours so we need to make this worth it." "How did you even know where I was?" Harry asked. "Followed the chaos," Ron said simply. "Half of Wizarding London seems to know something happened at the Ministry and we had to basically fight our way through the leaky cauldron, because everyone in there was talking about it. The goblins at the front told us where to go, which surprised me, honestly." "I authorized your entry," Ragnock said, from across the table. Ron startled slightly, clearly not having registered the goblin's presence immediately, which said a lot about how overwhelming the room's contents were. "You are, according to our records, 2 of the 3 individuals who have acted as Lord Potter's trusted allies in the field over the past several years. We thought it appropriate." Ron stared at Ragnock. Then he looked at Harry. Then back at Ragnock. "Right," he said carefully. "Hello." "Good afternoon," Ragnock said, with the exact cadence of someone who had been saying good afternoon to humans for centuries and had perfected the pronunciation while privately finding the custom mildly amusing. Hermione had already sat down and was pulling parchment from her satchel. "Harry," she said, and her voice was controlled and focused but had a thread underneath it that told him she was furious. "Not at him. For him. I need you to tell me everything, in order, starting from when you walked into the courtroom, because from what I've been able to piece together from second-hand accounts from the Ministry atrium the whole sequence it's extraordinary." Harry offered. "I was going to say unprecedented," she said. "But also extraordinary, yes." She looked at him properly then, a full searching look, the one that was checking whether he was actually all right rather than just upright. He met it directly, let her look, and after a moment she seemed satisfied. "Okay," she said. "Tell me." He told them. All of it, the hearing, the argument, the collapse, Ragnock's arrival, the corridor, and then the last 2 hours in this room. He kept it concise and chronological, the way you told things when the facts were extraordinary enough without embellishment, and Hermione took notes as he talked and Ron sat with his elbows on the table and his face cycling through an impressive range of expressions. When Harry got to the part about the unauthorized withdrawals, Ron's expression settled into something hard and flat that was very different from his usual openness. When he got to the intercepted letters, Hermione stopped writing for a moment and sat very still. "Dumbledore," she said. Quietly. In the exact same flat tone Harry had used. "Dumbledore," Harry confirmed. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "Okay," Hermione said, and clicked her quill against the table in a rhythm that meant she was organizing her thoughts at high speed. "Okay. Legal priority, the Black estate claim and the challenge to the criminal conviction needs to move today, which apparently it is. Second priority, the Wizengamot session in 4 days. Harry, 31 seats is a majority. Not a supermajority, but a simple majority, which means you can block the registration amendment and the detention powers expansion by yourself. Third priority, Dumbledore, Harry said. Third priority, Hermione said, is figuring out exactly what Dumbledore's role was, what legal exposure that creates for him, and what we want to do about it. She paused. And fourth priority is making sure that what happened today becomes public knowledge in a way that we control, rather than in a way that fudges people's shape. The Prophet, Ron said. Skeeter. Read a Skeeter, Hermione said slowly, with the expression of someone picking up a tool they found distasteful but undeniably useful, owes me a favor. Harry looked at her. Does she? I have been in possession of certain information about her for approximately 2 years, Hermione said precisely. I've never used it. Today seems like an appropriate day to call it in. What information? Ron asked. She's an unregistered animagus, Hermione said. Her form is a beetle. She was using it to eavesdrop on private conversations. I caught her in a jar. Ron blinked. You had her in a jar. For 3 weeks, Hermione said, without any audible guilt. She agreed to stop writing lies about Harry. She has so far kept that agreement. But an agreement to stop doing harm is different from an agreement to actively do good, and I think we need someone to do some active good right now. She uncapped her quill. I'll write to her tonight. Ragnarok, who had been listening to this exchange with the quality of an entity watching a mechanism function as designed, said, there is one additional matter. The 3 of them looked at him. The house proxies, he said. Currently, several of your 24 houses have their voting proxies assigned to other parties. Some of these assignments were made by previous family members and are still technically active. Others, a careful pause, were assigned without your knowledge or consent, under paperwork signed by your magical guardian. Harry went very still. Dumbledore assigned my voting proxies. For 12 of your houses, Ragnarok said. Without your knowledge. To individuals he deemed appropriate stewards. He produced a list and placed it on the table. You'll recognize several of the names. Harry looked at the list. He did recognize several of the names. They were all Ministry loyalists, all solidly in Fudge's camp, all people who had been, without Harry's knowledge, casting votes in his name for years. That's, Ron started, then seemed to feel that no word he could produce was adequate to the situation. That's, yeah, Harry said. Ragnarok, can I revoke those proxy assignments? Immediately, upon your written instruction, Ragnarok said. We anticipated you would want to. The revocation forms are in the 3rd folder from your left. Harry reached for the folder. He filled out 12 revocation forms with the focused efficiency of someone who had found the thing they were doing extremely satisfying. Each signature pulled the proxy out of the hands it had been sitting in and returned it to him. By the end his hand ached slightly from signing and he didn't mind at all. Right, he said. What's next? They worked through it for another hour, Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Ragnarok, with the 3 ledger goblins occasionally producing additional documentation on request, in a collaboration that was chaotic and fast-moving and, Harry thought, the most productive he'd felt in years. Hermione cross-referenced legal citations with the inheritance documents and caught 2 potential challenges to the house claims that needed additional supporting evidence. Ragnarok produced the supporting evidence with the air of someone who had already anticipated those exact challenges. Ron, who had the kind of strategic mind that rarely got credit because it operated through intuition rather than citation, identified the 3 houses in the claim whose status was most publicly visible and suggested that those 3 should be the ones highlighted in any public statement, because they were the ones that the average wizarding person would care about most. Gryffindor especially, Ron said. Tell me I'm wrong. Harry Potter, heir of Godric Gryffindor himself. That's not just politics, that's people will care about that. People will care about that in ways that Fudge can't easily spin, Hermione said, catching on. He can't call it political maneuvering if it's a historical blood claim validated by Gringotts. And goblins don't lie about blood claims, Ron said, with the confidence of someone who had grown up in a wizarding household and absorbed this as simple fact. Everyone knows that. It's not like the Ministry can contest it without basically declaring war on Gringotts. Harry looked at him. You're better at this than you let on. Ron shrugged with the particular discomfort of someone receiving a compliment in an area they pretended not to care about. Chess, he said. It's just chess. You can see the board from outside if you're not the one in the middle of it. Then keep seeing it, Harry said. I'm going to need people around me who can see the board. The afternoon light had deepened toward evening by the time they were done. Harry had lost track of time completely in the meeting room, which had no windows. When Ragnarok finally indicated that the session had covered everything urgent, Harry sat back in his chair and let the day settle onto him for a moment. It was considerable weight. The number of things that had changed in the space of 8 hours was almost incomprehensible, legally, financially, politically. He was a different person now, not in himself, but in what the world could no longer pretend he was. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said, as they prepared to leave. The Ledger Goblins were quietly collecting the documentation back into their careful order. There is one final item. Harry looked at him. Ragnarok reached into the carved wooden box and removed an object that Harry hadn't seen there before, or had seen and not registered, a ring. Heavy, dark metal, with a seal on it that Harry couldn't quite focus on directly, as if the magic in it redirected his gaze slightly. The Sovereignty Seal, Ragnarok said. It was created when the first of your blood claimed sovereign status. Every subsequent generation that has met the threshold has had the right to claim it. You are the first in 4 centuries to qualify. He held it out across the table. When you put this on, it will be recorded. Every magical institution in Britain will receive notification within 24 hours. The houses will recognize you formally. Your enemies will know, with certainty, that the claim is not procedural or theoretical. And my allies, Harry said. And your allies, Ragnarok agreed. Harry looked at the ring. He thought about the weight he'd felt in the courtroom, the 24 bonds pressing through him, magic that was older than the Ministry choosing to recognize him in a room full of people who wanted him diminished. He thought about Sirius, about his parents, about every generation of every one of 24 houses that had eventually, through blood or conquest or love, led to him. He reached out and took the ring and put it on. It was warm. The seal flared once, not visibly, but he felt it, deep in his sternum, in the same place the bonds lived. Then it settled, and it was just a ring, except that the room felt slightly different now, the way a room felt different when the last piece of a large piece of furniture had been put in place. Done, Ragnarok said, and there was satisfaction in it. Ron exhaled. Okay, he said. That was, yeah. That was something. That was the easy part, Hermione said quietly, but she was looking at Harry and she was smiling, not her bright public smile but the real one, the smaller one that meant she actually meant it. The hard part is what happens tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? Ron asked. The people who've been benefiting from Harry being manageable, she said, figure out that he isn't anymore. Harry flexed the hand with the ring. It fit perfectly, which he suspected had something to do with magic rather than coincidence. They already know, he said. Lucius Malfoy was in that courtroom. He saw everything. What do you think he's doing right now? Ron asked. Harry thought about the way Lucius Malfoy had sat in his chair and watched Harry's exit, the pleasant expression, the still hands, the rapid recalibration behind the pale eyes. He thought about a man who had spent decades building a web so comprehensive he'd probably stopped thinking of it as a web at all, just as the natural shape of the world. Making phone calls, Harry said. Or the wizarding equivalent. He stood up. So let's make sure we're already 3 moves ahead by the time he picks up the receiver. They left Gringotts as the sun was starting down toward the London rooftops, the evening light turning the white marble of the building's face a deep amber. Diagon Alley was quiet at this hour, the shops mostly closing, a few witches and wizards hurrying home with their purchases. Two of them stopped and stared at Harry as he came down the steps. Not the usual staring, the boy who lived staring, the curious half-recognition staring. This was different. Word had clearly moved faster than he'd expected, because these two witches, strangers, were looking at him the way people looked at something they were trying to decide whether to believe. One of them, a middle-aged witch with a shopping basket over her arm, met his eyes as he passed. She didn't say anything. But she gave him a small, deliberate nod. The kind of nod that wasn't about celebrity or legend. The kind that was between equals. Harry nodded back and kept walking. Behind him, in the various offices and drawing rooms and private studies of Wizarding Britain, the notification seals had already begun to glow. In a manor house in Wiltshire, Lucius Malfoy felt the ripple of the Sovereignty Declaration pass through his wards like a cold current and sat for a long time in his study chair, looking at the fire, thinking about chess boards and which pieces he had left to move. In a warm, cluttered office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore set down his quill and looked at the small silver instrument on his desk that had begun, very quietly, to whir and produce a thin thread of violet smoke, indicating a change in the status of the individual it was keyed to monitor. He sat with that information for a while. Then he said, very quietly, to the room, "Ah." And in a small house in Ottery Catchpole, Molly Weasley received an owl from Fred and George that said Ron was not there and had not been there, and she stood in her kitchen and gripped the letter and felt the particular cold worry of a parent who knows that something large has started and that their child is in the middle of it and that there is absolutely nothing they can do to pull them back from it now. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked to the end of Diagon Alley. Hermione was already drafting her letter to Rita Skeeter in her head. He could tell by her focused silence, the way she occasionally mouthed a phrase and then discarded it. Ron had his hands in his pockets and was being conspicuously silent in the way that meant he was actually thinking very hard. "You should come to Grimmauld Place," Harry said. "Both of you. Tonight. We've got a lot to plan before that Wizengamot session." "Mum's going to absolutely," Ron started. "I know," Harry said. A pause. "Worth it, though," Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. "It is." He turned up his collar against the evening air and they walked, the three of them together, and above them the first stars were coming out over London, and the ring on Harry's hand caught no light because it was too busy holding the weight of 24 bloodlines and a magic older than any of the people who had spent years trying to make him forget he carried it. Chapter 3, Old Magic and Older Grudges. Grimmauld Place at night was a different creature than Grimmauld Place during the day. During the day it was merely gloomy, a tall, narrow townhouse that smelled of old magic and older dust, its wallpaper peeling in deliberate strips, the portrait of Walburga Black covered behind its curtain with the particular energy of something that hadn't been defeated so much as temporarily contained. During the day you could open the curtains in the upstairs rooms and get enough grey London light to make it feel merely melancholy. At night it breathed. Harry had stayed here enough times to be past the point where it unsettled him, but he was also past the point of pretending it was ordinary. The house had a personality, not a pleasant one, but a distinct one, and it responded to presence the way very old things sometimes did, with a kind of reluctant accommodation. The stair that had always creaked on the fourth step from the bottom didn't creak for Harry anymore. He didn't know when that had changed. He'd arrived first, let himself in with the key that had come with Sirius's estate, and walked through the ground floor turning on lights. Hermione and Ron arrived 12 minutes later, Hermione with her satchel and Ron with a Weasley jumper pulled over his earlier clothes against the evening chill, carrying a paper bag that turned out to contain 4 pasties from a Muggle bakery near the Leaky Cauldron. "I didn't know what goblins eat," Ron said, handing the bag to Harry, "but I figured you hadn't eaten since this morning." Harry hadn't, as it turned out. He ate 2 of the pasties standing at the kitchen counter while Hermione sorted her notes onto the kitchen table and Ron made tea with the particular focused competence of someone who had grown up in a household where tea-making was treated as a genuine skill. They worked until past midnight. Hermione had, in the 6 hours since Harry's letter the previous night, assembled a legal brief that would have been impressive from a qualified solicitor and was frankly extraordinary from a 17-year-old student. It covered the procedural basis for challenging Sirius's conviction, the legal standing of the suppressed will, and a detailed analysis of which of Harry's 24 house claims were ironclad and which might face challenges from parties with competing interests. Harry read every word of it. He asked questions. Real ones, not the performative kind. He wanted to understand, not just to have the information available, because he'd decided somewhere between Gringotts and here that going forward he was not going to rely on other people understanding things on his behalf. That had been part of how he'd been managed for so long, the gentle steering away from complexity, the implication that these things were beyond him. They weren't. They were complicated, but complicated was different from beyond him, and the difference was whether someone wanted you to understand or wanted you to remain dependent on their interpretation of things. Ron fell asleep in his chair at about 11:30, which was not surprising and was not a dereliction. He'd contributed 3 hours of genuinely useful strategic thinking before his head started drooping, and Harry pulled a blanket from the sitting room and draped it over him without waking him. "He's got good instincts," Hermione said quietly, when Harry sat back down. "Always has," Harry said. "The house thing," she said. "Leading with Gryffindor. That was smart. I should have thought of it. You were thinking about 12 other things." "I'm always thinking about 12 other things," she said. "That's not an excuse." She tapped her quill against the table. "Harry. What are you going to do about Dumbledore?" He'd been waiting for her to ask it directly. She'd circled it all evening, it appeared in the margins of her notes, in the careful way she'd phrased certain sections of the legal brief, but she hadn't asked it outright until now. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'm angry. But I don't want to be stupid about it." "You won't be," she said. "You don't know that." "I know you," she said, with simple certainty. "You'll be angry and you'll be right and you'll be fair even when you don't want to be, because that's what you do. It's infuriating, honestly." Harry smiled at that. "I need more information before I move. I need to know exactly what he knew, what he did, and why." He paused. "The why is actually the part one care most about." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "You think there was a reason? That it wasn't just control for its own sake?" "I think Dumbledore doesn't do anything without a reason," Harry said. "The reasons might be wrong. They might even be monstrous, depending on how you look at them. But they're reasons. And I'd rather know them than make assumptions." She nodded slowly. "Gringotts might have more documentation. Things from the Potter Vault, from the original estate management." "I have an appointment with Ragnarok tomorrow morning," Harry said. "The full inheritance ritual." He said there'd be more information. Hermione went very still. "The full ritual?" "Harry, those can be, they go very deep. Are you ready for whatever it shows you?" He thought about the 24 bonds, the weight of them, the sensation in the courtroom of something vast and patient and specifically his. "I'll find out," he said. She looked like she wanted to say more. She didn't, which was its own kind of love. He let her go home at midnight. She had her apparition license and her parents' house was only a few miles and she was perfectly capable, and he covered Ron more thoroughly with the blanket and sat for a while in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place with the ring on his hand and the house breathing quietly around him and thought about tomorrow. Ragnarok had scheduled the appointment for 8 in the morning. Harry was there at 5 to 8, which surprised the junior goblin at the reception desk, who had clearly expected him to be late. Harry had grown up in the Dursley household, where being 5 minutes early to anything was the price of not being punished for being late. It had given him a punctuality that felt almost reflexive. Ragnarok met him personally, which Harry understood was not the standard arrangement. The Gringotts director did not typically escort clients to the inheritance ritual chambers. The fact that he did it today told Harry something about how seriously Gringotts was taking this. The ritual chambers were deeper than the meeting room, significantly deeper, the corridor sloping down at an angle that made Harry's ears pop twice before they arrived. The air here was different again, damper and warmer, with a faint smell of heated stone that reminded him oddly of the Chamber of Secrets, though nothing else about it did. The chamber itself was small and nearly bare. A stone floor with a circular depression in its center, ringed with carvings that Harry didn't try to read because Ragnarok was already guiding him toward the center and explaining with the efficient precision of a professional who had done this many times. The inheritance ritual reveals the full scope of your blood connections, Ragnarok said. It cannot be faked, cannot be manipulated, and, unlike the documentation we reviewed yesterday, cannot be questioned by any party without simultaneously questioning the integrity of blood magic itself. What it shows is what is true. What do I do? Stand in a circle. Place your right hand, palm down, on the stone. The magic does the rest. A pause. It will not be comfortable. How uncomfortable are we talking? Ragnarok considered. It varies by the depth of the inheritance. In your case, he left the sentence deliberately open-ended. Harry stepped into the circular depression and placed his palm flat against the carved stone floor. It was immediate and total. The world went somewhere else, and what replaced it was not quite darkness and not quite light, but something that his brain processed as memory, not his memory, not primarily, though he was present in it the way you were present in a very vivid dream. It was deeper than memory. It was the record of blood. He saw things in fragments and flashes, the way very fast things were seen, the Peverell brothers, 3 of them, and the sense of ancient magic and older bargains, the founding of Hogwarts and Godric Gryffindor with his sword and his laugh and his absolute refusal to be intimidated by anything including the future, generations of Potters, flashing past like a card deck shuffled at speed, each one adding something to the weight he carried, the Blacks with their pride and their tragedy and their magnificent stubborn love that they expressed mostly as anger. He saw his parents. James and Lily, in a moment that was not their death, he was grateful for that, but in a moment before it, the 2 of them in their living room in Godric's Hollow with James's arm around Lily and Lily laughing at something, and the memory of them was so vivid and so present that Harry's chest did something complicated and he breathed through it without looking away. He saw Sirius. Not dying, just there, a flash of him alive and defiant and grinning, and that one hurt in a way that was clean rather than festering, the kind of hurt that was just the shape of how much a person had mattered. And then the magic went somewhere else. Somewhere more recent. And Harry saw things that were not ancestral memories but documents. Records. Magical impressions of transactions, of decisions, of things that had been done in his name by people who had not asked. He saw Dumbledore, in the way you saw people in blood magic, not a vision of him but an impression, the magical signature of his choices against Harry's life. The vault withdrawals. The redirected mail. The proxy assignments. But also other things. Decisions about placement, the Dursleys, a deliberate choice made with full knowledge of what they were and how they lived, justified in Dumbledore's own sealed notes by a logic that Harry absorbed without flinching. The boy must not know his power too early. He must be kept humble. He must come to this war without the arrogance of a prince. Harry stood in the stone circle and let the impression of that decision settle through him. He understood it. He hated it and understood it simultaneously, which was one of the more adult things he'd ever been required to do. Dumbledore had believed, genuinely, with the full weight of a formidable intelligence behind the belief, that a Harry who knew what he was from birth would be corrupted by it. That the prophecy required not just a powerful wizard but a good one, and that goodness, in Dumbledore's architecture, required suffering as its foundation. Required ignorance of privilege. Required the particular resilience that came from having nothing. The logic was not evil. It was something arguably worse, it was caring, and wrong, and applied to another person's life without their consent. There was more. The blocks on his magic, he'd heard Ragnarok mention suppressions, and now he felt them, recognized them the way you recognized a tight space once it had been removed. 3 separate magical blocks, placed at intervals, the most recent when he was 13. They'd been subtle enough that he'd never identified them consciously, had just experienced them as the ceiling of his capability, the place where his magic stopped being fully responsive. Without them he'd been powerful enough. With them gone, and the ritual was dissolving them as it revealed them, pulling them apart the way you pulled apart something that had been tied too long and left marks in the fibers, with them gone, the magic came up like a tide. Harry had always been strong. He'd cast things at 13 that most adult wizards would have struggled with. He understood now that this had been his suppressed state. He stood in the ritual's circle and let the tide come in, and it filled him from the ground up, warm and vast and specifically, definitionally his, and it didn't feel like power the way power felt in stories, it didn't feel like violence or lightning or dominion. It felt like being exactly the size he actually was, for the first time in his life. The ritual released him. He came back to the chamber on one knee, he'd gone down at some point without noticing, and his right hand was pressed flat to the stone and the stone under his palm was warm. His vision cleared in stages. Ragnarok was standing exactly where he'd been, watching with those bronze eyes and an expression that was unreadable in detail but legible in overall quality. That was more than 24 houses, Harry said. His voice was rougher than usual. The ritual reveals all legitimate blood connections, Ragnarok said. Some of what you saw is historical only, claims that do not translate to active seats. But yes. The depth of your inheritance is exceptional. Harry stood up. He felt enormous and grounded simultaneously, like a tree that had just been told how deep its roots actually went. The blocks, he said. Gone, Ragnarok confirmed. They dissolve upon ritual recognition. They could not survive full acknowledgement of what they were. Who placed them? The blood impression identifies the magical signature, Ragnarok said carefully. One was placed at 15 months, your parents doing, we believe, as a protective measure, never intended to be permanent. One was placed when you were 7, this one we believe was not intentional, rather, it was a side effect of the specific protective magic surrounding the location of your residence. And one, Ragnarok paused. 13, Harry said. Yes. When you were 13. Ragnarok's voice was precise and neutral. The signature on the third block is Albus Dumbledore's. Harry nodded. He'd known it from the ritual, but hearing it stated plainly had its own weight. Why 13? Our analysis suggests it was placed after your second year at Hogwarts, Ragnarok said. After you destroyed the basilisk. After you demonstrated capabilities that fell significantly outside expected parameters for a 12-year-old wizard. A pause. We believe he became concerned. Concerned that I was too powerful, Harry said. Concerned that you were developing in ways he had not planned for, Ragnarok said, with the precision of someone who thought the distinction mattered. Dumbledore's architecture, as you'll have seen, was built around a specific version of you. The version that was kept humble. Kept dependent. Kept in appropriate contact with mortality. The bronze eyes held Harry's steadily. You were not cooperating with the architecture by being exceptional. Harry stood in the warm deep chamber and let that settle. There's a difference, he said slowly, between what Dumbledore did and what Voldemort does. Yes, Ragnarok said. But it's smaller than Dumbledore thinks it is. Yes, Ragnarok said again. They were quiet for a moment. Then Harry said, the documentation from the ritual, all of it, the blocks, the withdrawals, the proxy assignments, the mail interception, can that be formally recorded? Under Goblin seal? It already is, Ragnarok said. The ritual record is permanent and unalterable. It exists in Gringotts archive and a copy is held in the Goblin Nation's central repository in Prague. It cannot be destroyed, it cannot be legally challenged, and it cannot be denied by any party regardless of their position or authority. Good, Harry said. I want a certified copy. It will be ready within the hour. Harry walked back up through the deep corridors of Gringotts, and by the time he came back up into the public hall the morning rush had started and several witches and wizards stopped talking when they saw him and started again in lower voices. The Daily Prophet was visible on the counter of one of the teller's stations, its headline large enough to read from across the room. He crossed to the teller's counter and read it. Potter declared sovereign, Gringotts drops bombshell on Wizengamot. 24 House claim sends ministry into chaos. Fudge silent. Malfoy unavailable for comment. Below the headline, in slightly smaller text, full story, pages 1 to 4. Editorial, what this means for the wizarding world. Page 7. By our special correspondent Rita Skeeter. Harry picked up the paper. He read it. It was accurate. Which was not something he'd previously associated with Rita Skeeter's work, but Hermione had clearly delivered her instructions precisely, and Skeeter had followed them with the enthusiasm of someone who had been handed an extraordinary story and told the only condition was that it had to be true. It was also extraordinarily well written, which Harry had not expected. Skeeter had a genuine talent that her usual work didn't require her to use. The story of Harry's hearing, his collapse, Ragnarok's arrival, the declaration in courtroom 10, it was all there, and it was rendered in prose that managed to be dramatic without being lurid, which was, Harry thought, a genuine achievement for Skeeter. The paragraph that caught his attention was near the end of page 2. Skeeter had somehow gotten access, Hermione had clearly provided this, to the general outline of the unauthorized withdrawal situation, without naming figures. She'd also noted, in careful legal language, that questions had been raised about the management of Harry Potter's estate during his minority. She did not name Dumbledore directly. She didn't need to. Anyone who understood who Harry's magical guardian was would read the implication without being handed it. Harry set the paper back down. His mobile, the one Hermione had made him get after 5th year, on the basis that Muggle communication was harder to intercept than Owl Post, buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it. Hermione. 3 missed calls. 1 text, have you seen the prophet? Call me. He stepped outside Gringotts and called her back. She answered on the first ring. Harry. The prophet. I saw it, he said. Skeeter went further than I asked her to on the estate management angle, Hermione said, and she sounded both concerned and faintly approving, which was a very Hermione combination. She implied, without saying, that there were irregularities in the guardianship. I didn't tell her that specifically. She's smart, Harry said. She connected the dots herself. That's what I'm worried about, Hermione said. She's going to keep pulling that thread. Good, Harry said. A pause. Harry, Hermione, I know, he said, with the patience of someone having an argument they'd already had internally. I know he's Dumbledore. I know what he's done against Voldemort, what he's sacrificed, what he's built. I'm not trying to destroy him. But I'm also not protecting him from the consequences of what he did to me. Those are 2 different things. He paused. He made choices about my life without my consent. They weren't all wrong, but they weren't his to make. And some of them were, they were wrong. The kind of wrong that needs to be said out loud. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, okay, she said. I'm with you. I know, he said. Where's Ron? Sitting at your kitchen table eating everything in your refrigerator and reading the prophet out loud to himself in an increasingly delighted voice, she said. He's been doing character voices for the quotes from ministry officials. Harry laughed. It came out more freely than he expected. Come to Grimmauld Place. Both of you. I have the ritual documentation coming from Ragnarok in an hour and I want us to go through it together before I do anything else. What about Dumbledore? She asked. He'll have seen the prophet. He can wait, Harry said. I decide the timing. Not him. He felt the shift in her, a kind of recalibration, the same one Ragnarok had done in the courtroom, but warmer. Right, she said. See you in an hour. The certified ritual documentation arrived at Grimmauld Place by Goblin Courier at 9:45, an actual Goblin Courier, young one who presented the sealed package at the door with enormous gravity and departed without waiting for a tip, which Ron observed was quite a contrast from the regular owl service. Harry spread the documentation on the kitchen table. What the ritual had recorded was comprehensive, not just the inheritance confirmation but the full record of the blocks, the dates, the magical signatures. Hermione went through it with her legal mind and her annotations, and after 20 minutes she sat back and said, "Harry, this alone, the third block, Dumbledore's signature on it, the date, this is grounds for a formal complaint to the Wizengamot's Ethics Committee. What he did was not legal under the terms of the Magical Guardianship Agreement. He exceeded his authority significantly." "I know," Harry said. "We could file today," she said. "With the serious conviction challenge, with the proxy revocations, with—" "Not yet," Harry said. "Not Dumbledore. Not directly. Not yet." He looked at her steady, questioning expression. "There's a Wizengamot session in 3 days. I want to walk into that room with everything already in place. Every seat active, every proxy revoked, every documentation filed. I want to walk in there and let the room understand what's changed before I start the conversation about Dumbledore, because that conversation needs to happen in a context where I have the standing to make it stick." Ron, who had been quiet throughout, said, "You want to show them the board before you take the king?" "More or less," Harry said. "What do we do until then?" Ron asked. Harry thought about it. "We prepare. We reach out to the House representatives who've been sitting in the middle, the ones who aren't in Fudge's pocket but aren't committed to opposition either. Hermione, do you have the voting records for the last 2 Wizengamot sessions?" "I have the last 5, she said, pulling a scroll from her satchel. "Of course you do," Ron said, with deep affection. "They spent the morning mapping the political terrain of the Wizengamot the way you'd map unfamiliar ground before moving through it, carefully, with attention to what could be seen and what couldn't. Hermione had the historical records. Ron had a gift for identifying the human patterns in political behavior that made the records legible. And Harry, who had spent years being the subject of political maneuvering without the benefit of understanding the rules, found that understanding them now gave him a cold kind of clarity that he suspected was going to be very useful. The afternoon brought the first response from people who weren't them. Augusta Longbottom's owl arrived at 2 o'clock, carrying a letter that was brief, formal, and entirely explicit. Madame Longbottom wished to convey her personal congratulations on the inheritance declaration and to indicate that the House of Longbottom, which held 2 Wizengamot seats, had been observing the management of Harry Potter's affairs with significant concern for some time and would be open to discussing matters of mutual interest at his earliest convenience. She was watching, Hermione said, reading the letter over Harry's shoulder. In the courtroom, she wasn't just there as a member. She was watching for this specifically. She raised Neville, Harry said. She knows what it looks like when someone's being underestimated on purpose. The second letter was from Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE. It was more formal than Augusta's and more careful. Bones was a ministry official and she had to be, but between its careful lines was a clear message. She had initiated an internal review of the procedural conduct of today's Wizengamot hearing. She wanted it noted, for the record, that she had not been consulted about the invocation of Interim Procedural Code 7B and had in fact objected to it when informed. She would welcome the opportunity to speak with Harry Potter at his convenience. "She's protecting herself," Ron said, reading it. "She's also being honest," Harry said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He set the letter down. "I'll meet with her." "Before the session?" Hermione asked. "Before the session," he confirmed. "If she's willing to stand on the right side when it matters, I want her knowing exactly what's coming." The third letter was not a letter. It was delivered by a Hogwarts owl, one of the school's own birds, a great grey, and it was a single piece of parchment with a handwriting on it that Harry had seen on the back of more chocolate frog cards than he could count. "Harry, I expect you have a great deal to say to me. I expect I have a great deal to say to you. I am at Hogwarts and will remain here. When you are ready, I believe a conversation is overdue. Albus. Harry read it twice. He folded it carefully, the same careful fold he'd given the ministry's letter 3 days ago, which felt like a different lifetime, and put it in his inside pocket. Dumbledore? Ron asked. Yeah. What does he say? That he's waiting, Harry said. He picked up his quill. He can keep waiting. He pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward him. I'm writing to Neville. Ron looked slightly surprised. Why Neville? Because Neville has been through the same system Harry has, Hermione said, slowly, working it out. Different version, different circumstances, but the same machinery of people deciding what he should be and keeping him contained in it. She looked at Harry. You're building allies. Real ones. Not political alliances, people. The people are the politics, Harry said. The Wizengamot is just a room full of people. If I walk in there with institutional authority and nothing else, I'm just another lord with a block of seats. If I walk in there with Augusta Longbottom and Amelia Bones and people who understand why it matters, he paused, then I'm something different. He wrote to Neville. He wrote to Luna Lovegood, because Luna saw the world without the filters that most people couldn't remove, and that kind of sight was going to be valuable. He wrote to Bill Weasley, who had contacts at Gringotts and in the curse-breaking world and who was old enough to have his own read on the political situation. And he wrote to Amelia Bones, a reply, formally accepting her request for a meeting and suggesting tomorrow morning. He was sealing the last letter when Creature appeared. The old house elf materialized in the corner of the kitchen with his usual minimal drama, clutching a clean dishcloth to his chest and regarding Harry with the expression that had started as resentful tolerance and had gradually, over the past months, become something closer to complicated loyalty. He'd cleaned the kitchen while they worked, apparently, because it was considerably tidier than it had been and Harry hadn't noticed it happening. Creature has cleaned, Creature announced. And Creature has something to tell Master. Tell me, Harry said. A man came to the square, Creature said. Walking. Looking at the house. He paused with the timing of an old being who understood narrative weight. Not trying to find the house, because it cannot be found by those not told of it. Just walking. But Creature has seen him walk past before. 3 times today. And Creature knows his smell. He twitched his large ears. Malfoy smell. The father, not the son. Ron sat forward. Hermione looked up from her notes. Harry kept his voice level. Lucius Malfoy has been walking past the square. 3 times, Creature confirmed. The last time was 20 minutes ago. He can't get in, Ron said. He's not trying to, Harry said. He's checking whether I'm here. He thought about it. Which means he knows about Grimmauld Place, probably from his time with the Order, but he can't access it. He's trying to establish patterns. He wants to know where I'm going, what I'm doing, how to predict me. So what do we do? Hermione asked. Harry stood up from the table. He stretched, cracked his knuckles, and looked at the window with the particular expression he got when a decision had made itself. Nothing, he said. Not yet. Let him watch. He's not going to find anything useful in me walking between Grimmauld Place and Gringotts and the Ministry. He picked up his ring from where he'd briefly set it while sealing letters and put it back on. But it tells us something useful about him. What? Ron asked. He's nervous, Harry said. Lucius Malfoy has a 12-person staff and 6 different channels of institutional intelligence. If he's walking a square in person, it's because he doesn't trust any of those channels to give him what he needs. He paused. He's doing it himself because he's rattled. Hermione looked at Ron. Ron looked at Hermione. Good, Ron said. By evening the house had taken on the feeling of a headquarters, which was appropriate since it had been won before and seemed to settle into the role with something like eagerness. Hermione had commandeered the dining room table for her legal documentation. Ron had found, in one of the upstairs rooms, a board, an actual wooden board, like a large chessboard, and was using it to map the Wizengamot seat distribution with pieces he'd found and repurposed, so that the political situation of Wizarding Britain was being represented by a mix of chess pieces and old game tokens and at least two objects Harry didn't recognize. Harry stood in the doorway of the dining room and watched Hermione work for a moment, and then went upstairs and stood in the room that had been Sirius's and looked at the things on the shelves, the old Gryffindor colors, faded from years of Azkaban before they'd been restored. The photos. The small wooden box that Harry hadn't opened yet because he hadn't been ready. He was ready now. He opened it. Inside was a letter. Not the official documentation, not the will, but a letter, handwritten on Sirius's thick cream writing paper, addressed to him. He didn't know when Sirius had written it, before Azkaban, after, somewhere in between. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it. It was not a long letter. Sirius's handwriting was quick and slightly impatient, the writing of someone who thought faster than their hand and compensated with speed rather than neatness. It said, "Harry, if you're reading this then I've cocked it up somewhere and I'm sorry. I want you to know that everything I had is yours, not because you're James's son, though that matters too, but because you earned it. You earned it by being exactly who you are, which is better than most of the rest of us managed. The world is going to try to make you apologize for being powerful. Don't. Don't you dare." Harry sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then he folded the letter and put it in his inside pocket, next to Dumbledore's, which was the right place for it, a thing to carry, not to put down. He went back downstairs. "Right," he said, appearing in the doorway of the dining room where Hermione was still working and Ron had appeared from upstairs and was leaning in the doorway opposite with a cup of tea. "Let's talk about what we're doing tomorrow." "Amelia Bones," Hermione said. "Amelia Bones," Harry confirmed. "And then I want to walk the Wizengamot floor. Not for the session, just to see it. To stand in it with the ring on my hand and understand the room properly before I need it." He looked between them. "I keep making plans without having walked the actual ground, and I'm done with that." "You want to reconnoiter the Wizengamot," Ron said. "I want to understand what I'm walking into," Harry said. "There's a difference." "Not a big one," Ron said, but he was smiling. "The timing question," Hermione said, not looking up from her notes. "Lucius Malfoy. He's not just watching. He's planning a countermove. We've revoked the proxies, the inheritance declaration is public, the serious challenge is filed. He's going to try something before the session." "What can he actually do?" Ron asked. "Legally?" "Very little," Hermione said. "Illegally," she paused, "that's harder to predict." "He won't move illegally," Harry said. "Not yet. He's too smart to give me grounds for a DMLE complaint at this stage. He'll use the system." He thought about the way Malfoy had sat in the courtroom, hands folded, pleasant, watching. He'll find a procedural angle. Something in the inheritance documentation that he thinks is challengeable. Or he'll try to get to one of the houses, find a competing claimant, real or manufactured. Which of the 24 claims is most vulnerable? Hermione asked. Ragnarok thought the Greengrass seat, Harry said. Complicated collateral line. There's a living Greengrass heir who could potentially contest. Hermione was already writing. I'll research the Greengrass succession tonight. Hermione, Ron said, with genuine concern. You've been writing for 6 hours. I'll sleep when the session is over, she said, which was an extremely Hermione thing to say and which neither of them contested because they knew her well enough to know that contesting it was a waste of time that she would resent. Harry went to his room, Sirius's old house, his house now, technically, though that word sat in his chest at a slight angle still, and sat on the edge of his bed. Hedwig was perched on the headboard, watching him with her golden eyes. I'm going to go see Dumbledore, he said to her. After the session. Not before. He paused. I need to not be angry when I see him. Or, I need the anger to be the right temperature. Too hot and he steers the conversation. Too cold and it becomes about performance. He scratched her feathers. Middle temperature. She clicked her beak and regarded him with the pure-eyed serenity of a creature that had never once doubted the worth of the person it had chosen to accompany through the world. He slept, and dreamed about the ritual, the ancestral memories, his mother's laugh, Sirius grinning, Godric Gryffindor standing on some ancient hill with his sword across his shoulders and his face turned into the wind like he was looking forward rather than back. He woke up in the morning and felt the magic sitting in him like deep water. Not restless. Not requiring anything. Just there, fully and finally, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He decided. He got up, dressed, and went downstairs to have breakfast and go change the world at a measured, deliberate, and completely unhurried pace. Grimmauld Place's fourth stair from the bottom didn't creak when he stepped on it. It hadn't since the night Sirius died. He was starting to understand that the house had been grieving, and that it was done now, and that it was ready, in its old, vast, slightly temperamental way, to serve the person it recognized as its rightful lord. Morning, he said to it, generally, the way you said morning to a house when the house had earned it. The kitchen was already warm. Creature had put the kettle on. Chapter 4, Lords Don't Ask Permission. Amelia Bones had an office that looked exactly like the person who occupied it, spare, functional, everything in its place with the precision of someone who didn't trust disorder because disorder in her line of work meant people got hurt. The shelves held case files rather than decorative objects. The desk was clear except for what was currently being worked on. The only personal item visible was a framed photograph of a young girl, her niece Susan, Harry recognized, from Hufflepuff, sitting on a garden wall somewhere, laughing at something off camera. She stood when Harry came in, which surprised him. Senior ministry officials didn't generally stand for 17-year-old boys, regardless of their house status. Lord Potter, she said. The title came out naturally, without either deference or irony, which told him she'd decided how she was going to handle this before he'd walked through the door. Madam Bones, Harry said. Thank you for seeing me. Sit down, she said, and they both did, and she looked at him with the direct grey eyes of someone who had spent 30 years in law enforcement and had therefore become very good at seeing what people were actually doing underneath what they were pretending to do. Harry looked back without flinching, because he wasn't pretending to do anything. I'll be direct, she said. I find that people waste less time that way. Me too, Harry said. The hearing 2 days ago was improperly convened, she said. I filed an internal review. The conduct of the Administration Services Office in invoking 7B without DMLE consultation was in my view a deliberate procedural circumvention, and I intend to say so in formal documentation. She paused. That documentation will be uncomfortable for several people. Including the minister, Harry said. Including the minister, she confirmed, without hesitating. I want it noted that I am not doing this because of what happened at Gringotts. I am doing it because it was wrong, and it was wrong before Ragnarok walked into courtroom 10. I believe you, Harry said, and he did. Can I ask you something directly? Please. Why haven't you moved against Fudge before this? He asked. Not about me specifically, about any of it. The suppression of Voldemort's return. The smear campaign. The Dementor deployment. You've had the legal authority to push back on most of it and you haven't. The question landed and she didn't flinch from it, but she took a moment before answering, which he respected. Because I had Susan, she said. And because I had 23 employees in this department with families and lives and careers. And because pushing back against a minister who has the Wizengamot majority requires having enough ground to stand on that he can't sweep you away when he pushes back. A pause. I didn't have the ground. And now? Harry asked. She looked at the ring on his hand. Then at his face. Now the ground has rearranged itself somewhat, she said. 31 seats is not a supermajority. But it's a majority, and it's a majority that doesn't depend on ministerial patronage, which makes it different from any majority this chamber has seen in 20 years. She leaned forward slightly. What I need to know, Lord Potter, is what you intend to do with it. Block the registration amendment, Harry said immediately. Block the detention powers expansion. File the challenge to Sirius Black's conviction. Begin a formal review of the composition and conduct of the last 3 years of Wizengamot sessions. He paused. And push for a full inquiry into the management of the Ministry's response to Voldemort's return. Not a whitewash inquiry, a real one. Amelia Bones was quiet for a moment. That last one will end careers, she said. It should end careers, Harry said. People died because the Ministry spent a year and a half calling me a liar. That's not a procedural irregularity. That's a policy decision that got people killed, and the people who made it should answer for it. She nodded slowly. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. And Fudge? Fudge is a symptom, Harry said. The system that made it easy for Fudge to do what he did is the problem. I'm more interested in the system. He paused. Though I don't imagine Fudge survives a real inquiry either. No, she said. He won't. She sat back. What do you need from me? Your public support, Harry said. Before the session, not after. It's easy to stand on the right side once the vote's gone through. I need people who'll say so before they know which way the wind's blowing. She was quiet for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned that silence was only uncomfortable if you were afraid of what it might reveal, and he wasn't afraid of anything Amelia Bones might be thinking. All right, she said. You have it. They shook hands across the desk and Harry left, and he was in the corridor outside before he let himself feel the significance of what had just happened. Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE, 30 years of institutional credibility, the woman that half of Wizarding Britain trusted more than the minister himself, publicly committed, before the session, before the vote. He took the lift up 2 levels and walked the corridor to the Wizengamot Chamber's public entrance. The session door was unlocked, it was always accessible outside of formal proceedings, and Harry pushed it open and stepped inside and stood at the top of the tiered seating, looking down. Empty, the chamber was different again. Without the 47 members in their purple robes, without the weight of institutional performance, it was just a stone room. A very old stone room, with the marks of centuries in its walls and a floor that had heard more history than most countries managed. Harry walked down through the tiers slowly, running his hand along the carved rail of the upper tier, reading the nameplates on the seats. There were seats with no nameplates. 6 of them, scattered across the tiers, seats that had been empty for years because their houses had no acknowledged heirs and no active proxy. He looked at them and understood that some of these were his now, or his to fill by appointing proxies of his own choosing. He reached the floor of the chamber and stood in the center, where he'd stood 2 days ago in his rumpled robes with a stone floor against his cheek and a room full of people who'd wanted him gone. Different now. He stood there for about 2 minutes, just standing, getting the shape of the room into his body the way you needed to know a room when you were going to be doing something important in it. The acoustics. The angles. Where the light came from. Where the shadows were. Then he went back to Grimmauld Place, because they had work to do. The next 2 days moved at a pace that felt nothing like the crawl of his previous summers. Hermione had mapped the Wizengamot membership into 3 columns, firm opponents, potential allies, committed neutrals, and Harry worked through the middle column with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that politics was just a form of conversation and he'd been having difficult conversations his entire life. He sent formal letters, not requests, but notifications. House Potter, together with Houses Black, Gryffindor, Peveril, and 20 additional noble houses, intends to vote as follows in the upcoming session. He listed the votes. He listed his reasoning, clearly and without embellishment. He didn't ask for support. He stated his position and let the recipients decide what they wanted to do with the information. Hermione had told him to ask. He'd disagreed. Asking implies they have something I need, he'd said. I have the majority without them. What I'm offering them is the chance to be on the right side of a vote that's going to pass anyway. Ron had said, "That's actually quite cold, mate," in a tone that made clear he meant it as a compliment. The Greengrass situation resolved itself in a way Harry hadn't expected. Daphne Greengrass, a Slytherin in his year, cool and watchful and someone he'd always categorized as a background presence, sent him a letter. It was brief and startlingly direct for something from a Slytherin. She had seen the inheritance declaration, she was aware of the potential competing claim through her family's collateral connection to the Greengrass seat, and she wished to state that she had no intention of contesting it. Furthermore, her father, Lord Cygnus Greengrass, had authorized her to communicate that the House of Greengrass's proxy, currently assigned to a party she did not name but whose identity Harry could deduce from context, would be reassigned at their earliest convenience. He wrote back the same day. She replied within 2 hours. By the end of the exchange they had reached, without meeting in person and with no more than 4 letters between them, a working arrangement that was built on mutual practicality and a shared appreciation for efficiency. Harry thought that in another life he and Daphne Greengrass might have been friends. In this one they were, apparently, political allies, which was a different thing and in its way just as useful. The letters from the neutral bloc Wizengamot members started coming in on the second day. Most were cautious. Some were enthusiastic in the careful way of people who have been waiting for something to be enthusiastic about and were making sure it was real before they committed. 2 were hostile, those went into a separate pile, which Ron labeled Fudge's people with a marking quill in red, and Hermione crossed out and relabeled Keep an Eye On, which Harry thought was more precise. On the evening before the session, when the letters were dealt with and the strategy was as mapped as it was going to be, Ron said, "What about Malfoy?" "He's been quiet." "That's the point," Harry said. "He's planning something," Hermione said. She'd been saying this with increasing frequency, like a weather vane that kept pointing at the same storm. "I know," Harry said. "I've been trying to work out what. He's too smart to challenge the inheritance directly. Gringotts' seal is unassailable. He can't get the proxies back. He can't block the serious conviction challenge without making himself look complicit in the original miscarriage." He looked at Ron's board, the chess pieces and game tokens representing the Wizengamot. "He needs a move that doesn't look like a move." "That's what worries me," Hermione said. "Let it worry you," Harry said. "You're worried is better than most people's prepared." She looked momentarily surprised by that, then went back to her notes with the focused energy of someone who'd been given a direction and was now moving in it. The morning of the session, Harry was up at 6. He showered, dressed in proper formal robes, dark, well-cut, not ostentatious, because he wanted the ring to be the statement and nothing else, and went downstairs. Creature had breakfast waiting, porridge, toast, tea, all of it hot and precisely timed, because Creature had decided at some point in the past week that Harry was a person worth the full effort of his considerable domestic capabilities. Ron and Hermione arrived at 7:30. Hermione was in her best robes with her satchel. Ron was in dress robes that fit him properly, which was new, and Harry raised an eyebrow at them. "Mum," Ron said, slightly defensively. "She sent them this morning. With a letter." He paused. The letter was quite long. "What did it say?" Harry asked. "Mostly that she loves me and is furious with me and that I should be careful and also that she's been reading the Prophet and," he stopped. "And?" Hermione prompted. "And she said to tell Harry that she's proud of him," Ron said, looking at the table. "Which made me feel terrible for lying about Fred and George, for what it's worth." Harry looked at him for a moment. "Tell her the truth when this is over," he said. "She'll be angry. Then she'll be all right." "Yeah," Ron said. "Yeah." They walked to the ministry together. The atrium was busier than Harry had ever seen it at this hour. There were people clustered in groups with the particular energy of people who had heard something significant was going to happen and wanted to be adjacent to it. Several of them noticed Harry and a ripple moved through the space, the visual equivalent of a murmur. Harry walked straight to the lifts without looking left or right. Not because he was performing confidence but because he had a specific destination and a specific time and the people in the atrium were not his concern right now. There's photographers, Hermione murmured, very quietly, as the lift arrived. Good, Harry said. Level 10. The corridor. The door of courtroom 10, which was already open today, the chamber itself filling with purple-robed members in a process that had the organized chaos of something formal trying to look effortless. Harry paused at the door. The room today had a different quality from his first visit and from the empty room he'd walked yesterday. Today it was full and alive and crackling with the kind of energy that preceded significant events, the specific charge of a room where everyone present knew that what happened in the next few hours would matter. Members were finding their seats. Several conversations stopped when Harry appeared in the doorway and restarted in lower registers. He walked in. He walked down through the tiers to the floor and then, instead of standing in the center where he'd stood before, he turned to the left and moved along the lower edge of the curved seating to a section that had, 2 days ago, held a cluster of empty seats. There were name plates on them now. The Goblin Administrative Office had, apparently, moved with remarkable efficiency since the declaration. House Potter. House Black. House Peverell. House Gryffindor. And more, stretching along the arc, more seats than he could take personally, several of them designated for proxies he'd since appointed, Bill Weasley for House Pruitt, Augusta Longbottom's formal inclusion for houses she'd been managing in trust. Harry sat in the Potter seat. It was at the end of the block, positioned to have sight lines to most of the chamber, which he suspected was deliberate on Ragnarok's part when the seat plates had been arranged. The ring sat warm on his hand. Augusta Longbottom was already in her seat in the upper tier. She met his eyes across the chamber and gave him the same small, deliberate nod she'd given him in this room 2 days ago. He returned it. Amelia Bones was in the minister's advisory section along the wall. She didn't hold a Wizengamot seat, but her presence was formal and public, and anyone who knew her reputation understood what it meant that she was here rather than at her desk. Fudge arrived in the Chief Warlock's chair with the slightly overperformed authority of a man who had been told by multiple advisors to project confidence. He looked at the new seat configuration and his face did something complex and then smoothed out with visible effort. Lucius Malfoy was already in his seat. He had been, Harry suspected, in his seat for some time. He looked immaculate and unhurried, his silver blonde hair falling perfect over the collar of his robes, his hands folded with that practiced stillness. He was not looking at Harry. He was looking at a piece of parchment in front of him and making a note with a quill, with the air of someone deeply absorbed in administrative detail. Harry watched him for a moment and then looked away. The session opened with Fudge calling the chamber to order, standard formal language, register of members, acknowledgement of quorum. When the registry reached Harry's name, Fudge said it with the careful flatness of someone eating something they didn't like and refusing to show it. Lord Harry James Potter, sovereign of the noble and most ancient houses of Potter, Black, Peverell, Gryffindor, the clerk continued through all 24 names, and the chamber was perfectly silent through every single one of them, because there was nothing else to do with a list that long, present. Proxy assignments noted. A Wizengamot member Harry didn't know, older, in the middle tier, with the look of someone who had been attending these sessions for 4 decades and had opinions about everything, said, loudly enough to be heard throughout the chamber, unprecedented. Nobody disagreed with him. Fudge moved to the agenda. First item, the Magical Creatures Registration and Control Amendment. He began reading the amendment's formal summary. It was, as Harry had expected, written in the language of public safety and administrative efficiency and reasonable governance, the kind of language that wrapped objectionable content in enough bureaucratic padding to make it hard to grab hold of. What it actually proposed was a mandatory registration system for all non-human magical beings with a complexity rating above a certain threshold, with ministry oversight of their movement and employment, and with provision for emergency internment under expanded administrative powers. Harry waited until Fudge finished reading. Then he raised his hand. Fudge looked at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting this and had decided to process it as routine. Lord Potter. Harry stood. The chamber's acoustics caught his voice the way they'd caught it 2 days ago, clear and unhurried, carrying easily to the upper tiers. I move that the magical creature's registration and control amendment be tabled indefinitely pending a full impact assessment by an independent panel constituted outside the Ministry's permanent administration. Complete silence. Then Fudge said, with careful steadiness, the motion requires a seconder. Augusta Longbottom said, from the upper tier, seconded. The motion requires a vote, Fudge said. Then let's vote, Harry said, and sat down. The vote moved through the chamber the way Harry had expected it to, based on his mapping of the membership, which was to say that when the tally came back, the amendment was tabled by a margin of 4 votes, his block providing the foundation and 7 of the members from the middle column providing the rest, having apparently decided overnight that being on the right side of a vote that was going to pass anyway was preferable to explaining their position after the fact. Fudge announced the result in the tone of someone reading a document that has upset them. The chamber murmured. Lucius Malfoy's quill moved across his parchment in a single smooth stroke. Second item, the emergency detention powers expansion. Same process. Harry stood. Same motion to table pending independent review. Augusta seconded. Vote passed, this time by 6 votes because 3 more members from the neutral bloc had read the room correctly between the first vote and the second. Fudge's lime green hat was sitting very slightly crooked on his head and he didn't appear to have noticed. Third item was one Harry had placed on the agenda himself through the formal House motion process, a right that became available to him the moment the seat declarations were formalized. He'd submitted it 2 days ago, before the session, through Ragnarok, who had navigated the administrative pathway with the efficiency of someone who had been watching the Wizengamot ignore its own charter for decades and was enjoying the opportunity to apply it accurately. The third item was, formal petition for review of the conviction and imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, on grounds of denial of trial by jury, denial of legal representation, and unlawful suppression of a last will and testament. When the clerk read the item, the chamber's murmur became an actual wave of sound. Several members began speaking simultaneously. Fudge banged his gavel with the energy of a man who was aware this was inadequate to the situation but felt he should do something. Order, he said. Order. The noise reduced to its manageable level. He looked at Harry with an expression that was moving past discomfort into something that looked, under the surface management, like real fear. Lord Potter. Harry stood. Sirius Black was imprisoned in October 1981. He was not given a trial. He was not provided with legal representation. He was not informed of the charges against him in a formal legal proceeding. He was transported directly to Azkaban on the authorization of, and I'm going to read this from the documentation, so the record is accurate, Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of the DMLE, acting under emergency wartime powers that explicitly did not permit the suspension of the right to trial. The chamber was very quiet again. The right to trial, Harry continued, is not an administrative convenience. It is a foundational protection that exists specifically to prevent the miscarriage I am describing. Sirius Black spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime that he did not commit, without any of the procedural protections that the Wizengamot's own charter guarantees to every magical person on British soil. He died in 1995 while still legally classified as a fugitive, because the Ministry's willingness to acknowledge its own error was, and I'll be generous here, limited. He looked around the chamber. Many faces looked back. He didn't look at Malfoy. I am requesting a formal posthumous review, he said. I am requesting that review be completed within 60 days. And I am requesting that the suppressed will of Sirius Black be formally entered into the public record, under the ruling that a void conviction cannot serve as grounds for suppression. He paused. I also have a question for this chamber. If any member can cite a lawful basis for the denial of trial in this case that supersedes the Charter's fundamental protections, I'd like to hear it. Nobody spoke. Wonderful, Harry said, and sat down. The vote on the review petition passed by 11 votes. That was more than the margin he'd expected. Several of the committed opposition bloc abstained rather than voting against it, which was its own kind of statement. The Sirius Black question was, apparently, one that even Fudge's reliable supporters found difficult to defend in direct public session. Harry was noting that fact when Lucius Malfoy stood up. He stood with the smoothness of a planned movement, which it obviously was. He had been waiting. Harry felt the hairs on the back of his neck respond, not fear, but attention, the particular sharpening of someone who sees the move they've been waiting for begin. "Chief Warlock," Malfoy said. "With the Chamber's indulgence, I wish to raise a point of order." "The chair recognizes Lord Malfoy," Fudge said, with a quality in his voice that was relief, which told Harry that Fudge had known this was coming. There it was. Malfoy reached into his robes and produced a folded document. He unfolded it with the unhurried deliberation of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "The Charter of the Wizengamot," he said, "includes provision for challenge to the standing of any member whose seat declaration is under active legal dispute. I am filing, on behalf of an interested party I will identify momentarily, a formal challenge to the standing of Lord Potter's House of Greengrass seat assignment, on the grounds that the Greengrass family succession is contested under." "The Greengrass family succession is not contested," Harry said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He just said it. Malfoy paused. He looked at Harry for the first time in the session, direct and cool. "I'm afraid Lord Potter is mistaken." "My client, your client is Cassius Mulciber," Harry said. "He holds a tangential claim through the Greengrass collateral line that was formally renounced by his grandfather in 1952, which means it doesn't legally exist. I have the renunciation document. Under Goblin seal. Filed with Gringotts Archive and registered with the Wizengamot's own succession records, which the administration office appears to have misplaced at some point but which we retrieved from the archive this morning." He produced a folder that Hermione had put together the night before. "The claim is void. Has been void for 70 years. Malfoy's expression didn't change. It was very controlled and very precise, and the only thing that moved was something behind his eyes that recalibrated. Harry watched it and recognized it, the adjustment, the same one from the courtroom. He was moving to his second option. "Even granting that," Malfoy said, smoothly, without pause, "there remains the question of whether a concentration of 31 seats in a single holder is consistent with the Wizengamot's founding principles of distributed representation, a question which I believe warrants examination by the Constitutional Committee before the founding charter," Augusta Longbottom said, from the upper tier, with the decisive speed of a woman who had been sitting on this particular response for 2 days. "Makes no provision for concentration limits. There is no such limit in any version of the charter. I have read them all. The argument has no foundation." "Perhaps," Malfoy said, "but the spirit of the charter, Lord Malfoy," Harry said. Malfoy looked at him again. "You're a very intelligent man," Harry said. "So I'm going to be direct with you. The Mulciber claim is dead. The charter argument has no legal basis, as Madame Longbottom correctly notes. The inheritance declaration is under Goblin seal, and you know as well as I do that you can't touch it." He paused. "Whatever you're actually trying to do here, you should know that I've been 3 moves ahead of you since the day Ragnarok walked into this chamber. If you have a move that isn't a distraction, make it. If you don't, sit down." The chamber was so quiet he could hear the ventilation in the walls. Something moved across Lucius Malfoy's face. Not anger, he was too controlled for that to show directly. But something shifted in the register of his expression, something that moved from the category of managed opposition into something more personal. Harry had just told him, publicly, precisely, that his moves were known and anticipated. For a man who operated on the premise that nobody could see what he was doing, that was not a small thing to hear. Malfoy sat down. He did it smoothly, with complete apparent composure, and Harry gave him full credit for that. Then he made a note on his parchment and did not look at Harry again for the rest of the session. That was when Harry knew he'd won the day. Not the vote, he'd known the votes before he walked in. He'd won the room. The chamber was reading the exchange the way audiences read any contest of authority, looking for the moment when the balance tipped, and it had tipped, and everyone present knew it. Fudge moved through the remaining agenda items with the energy of a man walking through something he knew was going to fall on him and was trying to get to the other side of it quickly. Harry voted on 2 minor administrative matters without incident. The session was formally closed 40 minutes later. Harry gathered his documents and moved toward the door. He was aware of people watching, was aware of the cluster of conversations breaking out in his wake, but he kept moving because there was still one thing left to do today and he wanted to do it while the momentum of the session was in him. He found Amelia Bones in the corridor outside. She looked at him with those direct gray eyes and said, simply, "Well." "Well," Harry agreed. "The Mulciber challenge," she said. "How long have you had the renunciation document?" "Since yesterday morning," he said. "Hermione found it." "Who is Hermione?" Bones asked. "My friend," Harry said. "She's going to be a formidable person when she graduates." A pause. "She already is, actually." Bones almost smiled. "What you said to Malfoy," she said. "Publicly. In session." She seemed to be working out how she felt about it. "He's not going to forget that." "I know," Harry said. "He's going to escalate." "I know that too," Harry said. "But he can't escalate within the law. I've closed every legal avenue he had. If he goes outside the law," he paused, "that's your department." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll have my people watching." "Thank you," Harry said. He turned to go. "Lord Potter." Her voice stopped him. He turned back. She was looking at him with something that wasn't quite the professional assessment of the last several days, something more than that, or different from it. "Sirius Black," she said. "I knew him. Not well. We were at Hogwarts at the same time, different years." A pause. "He deserved better than what happened to him." Harry held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "He did." He left her in the corridor and found Ron and Hermione waiting at the end of it, where they'd been watching the session from the public observation level above the chamber. They didn't have Wizengamot access, but the session was open to observation and they'd been up there the whole time, close enough to see. Hermione's expression was controlled but her eyes were very bright. Ron looked like someone who had just watched a particularly good game of chess from an advantageous angle. "The Mulciber document," Hermione said, immediately. "He didn't know we had it. I could tell from across the room." "He didn't know," Harry confirmed. "How'd you find it, in the end?" "It was misfiled," she said, with a quality in her voice that suggested misfiling documents was a personal offense she took extremely seriously. "In the Wizengamot Succession Archive, under the wrong family name. Someone had indexed it incorrectly, possibly accidentally, possibly not." She paused. "I found it because I looked at every document in the relevant section rather than just the ones that appeared responsive to the search." "Of course you did," Harry said. "The Malfoy moment," Ron said. He was trying to sound casual and not quite getting there. "When you told him to sit down and he just did. In front of everyone." He paused. "That was genuinely one of the most satisfying things I have ever seen." "He's not done," Harry said. "Oh, I know," Ron said. "But it was still satisfying." They walked up through the ministry and back into the afternoon, the three of them, through the atrium, more people stopping to look now, the news clearly having moved fast through the building's floors, and Harry walked through it without stopping, hands easy at his sides, the ring doing its quiet work of existing. Outside on the London street, Hermione stopped and turned to him. "You know what happens next," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Harry said. "Are you ready?" He thought about Sirius's letter. The middle temperature. The specific, focused anger that wasn't hot enough to be shaped by the other person and wasn't cold enough to become performance. "Getting there," he said. That evening, alone in Sirius's study at Grimmauld Place, Harry took out a piece of parchment and a quill and wrote 2 sentences to Albus Dumbledore. "I'll be at Hogwarts on Saturday morning. We should talk. He sent it with Hedwig and then sat in the study for a while, looking at the books on the shelves, Sirius's books, his books now, and the ring on his hand caught the firelight and held it. In Wiltshire, in the study of Malfoy Manor, Lucius Malfoy sat alone with the fire and a glass of fire whiskey and a piece of parchment on which he had made 4 careful notes. His face was composed and private and revealed nothing, which was its purpose even when he was alone, because people who controlled their expressions only in company eventually lost the ability to do it under pressure. He looked at his notes for a long time. Then he added a 5th note, drew a careful line between it and the 2nd note, and looked at the connection between them with the focused attention of a man who had found something. Outside his window, the Wiltshire night was very dark and very quiet. He picked up his quill again. Chapter 5, Fire and Sovereignty. The owl from Lucius Malfoy arrived on Friday morning. Harry was in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place eating toast and reading through the Wizengamot's charter, the original, not the Ministry's annotated version, which Ragnarok had provided in a leather case the previous afternoon with the note that the 2 versions differed in 17 places and that the differences were instructive, when the bird arrived at the window. It was an imperial eagle owl, white and enormous, and it landed on the windowsill with the particular authority of something that had been trained to expect doors opened for it. Harry opened the window, took the letter, and fed the owl a piece of toast. The owl accepted this with an air of mild condescension and departed. The letter was brief. Beautifully written, Malfoy had the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write as a form of self-presentation, each letter precise and deliberate. It said, "Lord Potter, I write to suggest a private meeting before further public proceedings, in the interest of reaching an accommodation that serves both our positions. I have information that I believe you would find significant, and proposals that may align more closely with your stated objectives than our recent exchanges might suggest. I am available at your convenience." L. Malfoy. Harry read it twice. Then he put it on the table and looked at it while he finished his toast. Ron came downstairs 10 minutes later, saw the letter, read it, and said, "Absolutely not." "I agree," Harry said. Ron looked at him. "Then why are you still reading it?" "Because I'm trying to work out what he has," Harry said. "He says he has information." "That's not a negotiating tactic. Malfoy doesn't open with his actual position. If he's saying he has information, he has something that he thinks changes the shape of the board." He picked up the letter and read it a 3rd time. "The question is whether it's real or whether it's a constructed thing designed to get me into a room with him." "Either way, you shouldn't go," Ron said. He sat down and reached for the remaining toast. "Or if you go, not alone. And not to Malfoy Manor." "I'm not going at all," Harry said. "Not yet. I want to know what he has before I decide whether the information is worth the conversation." Hermione arrived at 8, later than usual and slightly breathless, which meant she had information that had displaced her normal morning precision. She dropped her satchel on the table and said, "The Prophet runs a correction today. Page 6. It's small but it's there." Harry looked at her. "What correction?" She produced the paper. Page 6, as she'd said, bottom right corner, a 3-paragraph item that corrected a detail in the original story about Harry's inheritance declaration. Specifically, it corrected the number of houses. The original article had listed 24. The correction said 23. "Which one?" Harry asked. "House Selwyn," Hermione said. She sat down. "The correction claims a clerical error in the original Gringotts declaration. It says the House of Selwyn was included in error and that the actual count is 23 noble houses." Harry was already reaching for his mobile. He called Ragnarok's office. Ragnarok had provided a contact number 2 days ago with the explanation that some situations required faster communication than owls, which Harry had found both practical and slightly touching in its pragmatism. Ragnarok answered on the 2nd ring. "The Prophet correction," Harry said, without preamble. "We are aware," Ragnarok said. His voice had a quality that Harry had not heard in it before, controlled, but with an edge underneath. "The correction is false." House Selwyn is legitimately included in your inheritance declaration. We made no clerical error. Then where did the correction come from? That, Ragnarok said, is an extremely good question. Someone applied pressure to the Prophet's editorial office. We do not yet know who, but we have suspicions, and we are pursuing them through our own channels. A pause. Mr. Potter, this is not a procedural challenge. Someone has actively attempted to alter the public record of your declaration. That is, considerably more serious than the Mulciber Gambit. Harry thought about Malfoy's letter. The fifth note, the careful line between notes. The House of Selwyn, he said. What's significant about it specifically? The Selwyn seat, Ragnarok said, carries a specific provision under the original Noble House Charter. One of 12 seats that hold veto power over constitutional amendments. If you hold it, you hold a veto that cannot be overridden by any majority, however large. If you don't hold it, he left the conditional open. Someone else holds the veto, Harry said. Precisely. Harry looked at the newspaper correction. Then at Malfoy's letter. Then at the ceiling of the Grimmauld Place kitchen, which was old and slightly stained and completely uninvolved in any of this. He found it, Harry said. That's what he has. That's his information, not that the Selwyn seat is in question, but that he's the one creating the question. He's going to try to use this as leverage. Agree to his terms or he keeps the pressure on the Prophet and manufactures enough public doubt about the declaration that the Wizengamot feels justified in calling for a formal review. A formal review, Ragnarok said, would take 60 days under the Charter's standard process. During which time the seats would be in dispute and your voting bloc would be reduced. Right, Harry said. Which means the registration amendment comes back, the detention powers expansion comes back, and Fudge has his window back. He paused. Ragnarok, can we prove the correction is false? Quickly. Before they manufacture any more doubt. We can produce the original registration documentation, the blood verification, and the full succession chain for House Selwyn within the hour, Ragnarok said. In public, if needed. Make it public, Harry said. I want it filed with the Wizengamot's registry office, released to every major publication simultaneously, and I want a goblin representative present when it's delivered so nobody can claim it arrived through uncertain channels. He thought for a moment. Do you have standing to make a formal complaint about the attempt to alter the public record? A pause that was not long but had satisfaction in it. The Treaty of 1752 allows the Goblin Nation to file a formal complaint with the Wizengamot's Ethics Committee in cases where documented manipulation of an inheritance declaration is demonstrated. We have not used that provision in 93 years. Another pause. We would be very pleased to use it today. File it, Harry said. He put his mobile away. Hermione and Ron were both watching him. What do we do? Hermione asked. We don't respond to Malfoy's letter, Harry said. We don't acknowledge it. We don't meet him, we don't send a counteroffer, we don't give him any signal that his move landed. He stood up. Instead, Gringotts is going to file an ethics complaint in the next hour. We're going to be there when they do it. And I'm going to walk into the ethics committee office personally, with documentation, and make the complaint in public. Ron looked at him. You're going to make Malfoy the one under investigation. He attempted to manipulate an inheritance declaration under Goblin Seal, Harry said. That's not a political disagreement. That's a crime. The question is whether the ethics committee has the spine to treat it like one. He picked up his robes from the chair where he'd left them. Let's go find out. The Ministry of Magic's Ethics Committee occupied a suite of offices on level 3 that Harry had never visited and that had, from the look of the waiting area, been designed to discourage enthusiasm. The furniture was several decades old and aggressively beige. The lighting was fluorescent and slightly too dim. The receptionist looked like someone who had been sitting at that desk since before Harry was born and had opinions about being interrupted. She looked significantly less composed when Harry walked in with Ragnarok at his side and 2 Gringotts legal attaches behind him carrying sealed documentation cases. "Lord Potter," she said. "And, Director, Ragnarok," said Ragnarok, in his voice that managed to make his name sound like a formal institution. "We are here to file a complaint under Treaty Provision 11, Clause 7. We require the senior ethics officer." "The senior ethics officer is available," said Ragnarok, without room for the alternative. The senior ethics officer was a slight, brisk witch named Millicent Bagnold, no relation to the former minister, she clarified immediately upon meeting them, with the practiced efficiency of someone who clarified this several times a day, who led them into a conference room and listened to the full presentation without interrupting. Ragnarok presented the complaint. The legal attaches laid out the documentation. Harry answered 3 questions she directed at him, each one specific and procedural, and gave her specific and procedural answers. When it was done, she sat for a moment and looked at the table. "The evidence that pressure was applied to the Prophet's editorial office," she said carefully. "Can that be substantiated?" "We are prepared to provide the relevant documentation," Ragnarok said. "Which includes the Goblin-sealed original declaration, demonstrating that no error existed to correct, and therefore that the correction was not editorial but external. If I accept this complaint," she said, "it triggers an automatic notification to all parties named or implicated. Lord Malfoy would be informed." "I'm aware of that," Harry said. "I want him informed." She looked at him. "You want him to know that we're investigating?" "I want him to know that I know what he did," Harry said. "And that I responded through proper legal channels rather than matching his methods." A pause. "That's a message worth sending." She made a note. "The investigation will take, I'd like to request expedited review," Harry said. "The attempted manipulation of my inheritance declaration is directly related to ongoing Wizengamot proceedings. A 60-day standard timeline isn't adequate to prevent ongoing harm. Expedited review requires a showing of ongoing Wizengamot proceedings affected by the manipulation," Harry said. "Which we have. The registration amendment is tabled pending independent review that hasn't yet been constituted. If the inheritance declaration is successfully challenged during that window, the vote could be reopened. That's direct and immediate impact." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've done this before," she said. "No," he said. "I read the procedure." She almost smiled. "Expedited review is approved," she said. 14 days. They left the Ethics Committee offices at 11. In the lift going back up, Ragnarok said, without preamble, "The letter from Malfoy. You haven't responded." "No," Harry said. "He will interpret your silence as either contempt or confusion," Ragnarok said. "He is probably not certain which." "Good," Harry said. "Let him wonder." "He will make another move," Ragnarok said. "Before your Saturday appointment at Hogwarts. He would prefer to resolve this before you have whatever conversation you're going to have with Dumbledore, because that conversation changes the landscape in ways he can't predict." Harry looked at him. "How do you know about the Hogwarts appointment?" "We know most things," Ragnarok said, without apology. "It is our business to know most things. That is precisely why people trusted us with their money for 9 centuries and only occasionally regretted it." A pause. "We know that Dumbledore has been active since the ethics complaint was filed this morning. He has sent 3 letters. We do not know their contents." "Who did he send them to?" "Fudge. Amelia Bones. And you." The letter from Dumbledore was waiting at Grimmauld Place when they returned, delivered by a Hogwarts owl. That creature had apparently let in and fed and settled on the perch in the hallway with what seemed like genuine domestic hospitality, which was new behavior from Creature and said something about the shift in the house's atmosphere over the past week. Harry read the letter in the hallway. "Harry, I have heard about this morning's proceedings with considerable interest. I want you to know that I intend to make myself available to cooperate fully with any formal inquiry into matters relating to your guardianship. I have always acted in what I believe to be your best interests, and I understand that you may see certain decisions differently now that you have more context. I hope Saturday's conversation will allow us both to speak with clarity and honesty. I also want to say, and this is separate from everything else, that I am proud of you. Whatever you may feel about my choices, watching you these past days has confirmed what I always believed, that you are more than prepared for whatever this world requires of you. Albus. Harry stood in the hallway of Grimmauld Place and read the letter twice. Ron appeared in the kitchen doorway. He read Harry's face rather than asking what was in the letter. Bad, he said. No, Harry said. That's the problem. He put the letter in his pocket with the others. Sirius's letter was in there. Dumbledore's first letter was in there. Now this one. He was building up a correspondence that represented, more or less, the full spectrum of how people related to him, love expressed as self-sacrifice, affection dressed as apology, and the peculiar thing Dumbledore did which was to be entirely genuine and entirely insufficient simultaneously. He was still thinking about it when the second thing happened. It started with Creature. The old elf appeared at Harry's elbow at 2 in the afternoon with the expression he wore when he had something urgent and was making it dignified. There is someone at the square, he said. Malfoy again? Harry asked. Not Malfoy, Creature said. He paused. A young lady. She has been there 1 hour. She has a letter in her hand and she keeps looking at the houses as if she is not certain she has the right place. He paused again. She is wearing Slytherin colors. Harry went to the front window and looked out at the square through a gap in the curtain. The girl was easy to spot, she was the only person in the square who was standing still, everyone else crossing with the purposeful movement of people going somewhere. She was perhaps his age, with dark blonde hair and a perfectly composed face that was doing a lot of work to stay composed. She had a letter in her left hand. Daphne Greengrass, Harry said. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the step. She saw him immediately and after a moment she crossed the square toward him with the particular walk of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it through before they reconsidered. I wasn't sure this was the right address, she said, when she reached the step. I had it from, it doesn't matter. I wasn't sure. It's the right one, Harry said. Come in. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came in. He brought her to the kitchen. Ron looked up from the chessboard. He'd been reorganizing the pieces from his Wizengamot representation into an actual game, apparently, for something to do with his hands. Hermione looked up from her notes. There was a brief social adjustment in the room. Daphne Greengrass in Grimmauld Place kitchen was an unusual enough combination that everyone needed a second to process it, and then Harry said, tea, because that was generally the right response to uncertainty. Yes please, Daphne said, and sat down. She didn't look at Ron and Hermione with hostility. She looked at them with the careful attention of someone in an unfamiliar situation who was mapping it accurately before speaking. Harry found himself reassessing her. He'd categorized her as a background presence for 6 years because she'd been quiet and contained in Slytherin and those things had combined in his experience to read as either indifference or low-level threat. Sitting in the kitchen now she read as neither. She read as someone who was extremely watchful and had spent a long time being watchful in an environment where the wrong move was expensive. Your letter said you had information, Harry said, once the tea was poured. My father received a visit yesterday evening, she said. From a representative of Lord Malfoy. The representative had a proposal. She picked up her tea and held it without drinking. The proposal was that our house's proxy, which we recently reassigned to your block, should be reassigned again. To a party of Malfoy's choosing. In exchange for, she stopped. Started again. In exchange for certain guarantees regarding my family's business interests, which Malfoy has been in a position to influence for some years. He was threatening your father, Ron said. He was offering my father protection, she said, precisely. Which is a different thing in Malfoy's vocabulary. But yes. She set her tea down. My father is not a brave man. I want to be honest about that. He considered the proposal seriously. He spent most of the night considering it. A pause. He chose not to accept it. But his not accepting it doesn't mean Malfoy won't find another lever. She looked at Harry. I thought you should know. Why are you telling me? Harry asked. Not skeptically. Genuinely. She considered the question with what seemed like real care. Because Malfoy has been finding levers with our family for 8 years, she said. And I'm tired of it. And because watching what you did in the Wizengamot session, she paused, things I didn't think could be changed are apparently changeable. That seems like information worth acting on. Harry looked at her. Then he said, is there anything specific Malfoy used against your father? Something documented? Several things, she said. Some of it relates to business arrangements that my father entered into during the war. He wasn't a Death Eater. But he made accommodations that he'd prefer not examined in daylight. Most people did, Hermione said quietly. Daphne glanced at her. Something shifted slightly in her composed expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition. Yes, she said. Most people did. She looked back at Harry. What Malfoy has been using is documentation of those arrangements. He's held it for years. If that documentation were no longer exclusively in his possession, it loses its power as a lever, Harry said. Considerably, she said. I can't make Malfoy's private documents disappear, Harry said. That's not something I'm willing to do. I know, she said. But if the same documents were part of a formal ethics committee investigation, they'd be part of a legal proceeding. Which changes their status. Which means Malfoy can't threaten to produce them quietly without producing them formally, with all the scrutiny that involves. She looked at him steadily. I think you might already have an ethics complaint in progress. Harry regarded her for a long moment. You're suggesting I add your father's situation to the existing complaint. I'm suggesting it might be relevant, she said. To the question of Malfoy's pattern of behavior. Ron said, from across the table, with the tone of someone who had been listening carefully, she's right. It is relevant. And it makes the complaint stronger. Harry looked at him. Then at Hermione, who had already opened her notes to a fresh page. Then at Daphne Greengrass, sitting in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place with her tea going cold and her face composed and her eyes saying several things that her voice was too careful to say directly. I'll need a formal statement from your father, Harry said. Signed. If we're going to include it, it needs to come from him, not from you. He'll give it, she said. Now that the decision is made, he'll give it. A pause. He's not a brave man, but he's not a stupid one. He knows which way this is going. Okay, Harry said. Have him send it to Hermione. She's coordinating the documentation. Daphne looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Daphne. Some compact was established between them that had nothing to do with Harry and that he suspected would be productive. Is there anything else? Harry asked. One thing, Daphne said. She hesitated, the first genuine hesitation he'd seen from her. The representative Malfoy sent. He mentioned, in passing, as if it were incidental, that there would be a hearing. A new one. Not in the Wizengamot. Harry went still. What kind of hearing? The representative said something about the magical accidental reversal squad's jurisdiction over the events at the ministry last year, she said carefully. The Department of Mysteries incident. He said there were questions about whether unauthorized magic was used in a ministry facility and whether that should have separate consequences from the Wizengamot proceedings. She paused. He said it very casually. As if it were already arranged. The kitchen was quiet. He's going around the Wizengamot, Hermione said. Her voice was careful and fast, the voice she used when she was thinking something through at full speed. If he can't challenge the inheritance declaration and he can't win in the Wizengamot session and the ethics complaint is going to constrain him, he finds a different venue. A Mars hearing isn't subject to the same charter protections. It's a disciplinary proceeding. If they could get a finding against Harry in a Mars hearing, they could use it to argue that a serving Wizengamot member with an active disciplinary finding has compromised standing, Harry said. He'd arrived at the same place she had, about 4 seconds behind. It's not a direct challenge to the inheritance. It's a challenge to my ability to use it. Can they actually convene that hearing? Ron asked. Mars' jurisdiction over incidents at the Ministry is murky, Hermione said. She was writing. It's possible. It would take Fudge signing off on it. And Malfoy. She looked up. It could move fast. Faster than the ethics complaint. How fast? Harry asked. If they've been preparing it, she looked at Daphne. The representative implied it was imminent, Daphne said. I got the impression he was telling my father so that my father would understand that backing the winning side was time-sensitive. Harry stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the square, the same square Malfoy had walked 3 times, looking at the house he couldn't find. He thought about Lucius Malfoy in his study in Wiltshire with his 5th note and his careful line between ideas. He thought about the way a chess player responded when their main attack was blocked, not by retreating but by opening a second front. He turned back. What time is it? Just past 3, Ron said. Amelia Bones, Harry said. Now. Not tomorrow. Now. She might not be in her office on a Friday afternoon, Hermione started. She'll be in her office, Harry said. She told me her people would be watching. She'll know something's moving. She'll be in her office. He was right. Amelia Bones was at her desk when Harry was shown in 20 minutes later, and she had the look of someone who had been expecting him, which confirmed that her people had indeed been watching and had seen Daphne Greengrass entering Grimmauld Place and had drawn reasonable conclusions. Mars, Harry said, as he sat down. I heard an hour ago, she said. The request for a disciplinary hearing went to the Mars senior officer this morning. It needs my signature to go forward. And? Harry asked. I haven't signed it, she said. Nor do I intend to. She folded her hands on the desk. The basis for Mars' jurisdiction is extremely thin. The Department of Mysteries incident involved magic performed by multiple parties in an actively hostile situation. Applying Mars' jurisdiction to magic used in self-defense during what was effectively an unsanctioned paramilitary attack on Ministry premises requires a reading of the Mars Charter that is, she paused, creative. Malfoy's been creative before, Harry said. He has, she said. But this time he needed my signature, and I'm not giving it. She looked at him steadily. However, not giving it doesn't prevent him from going above me. Fudge. Fudge has the authority to convene a Mars hearing under emergency powers without DMLE sign-off, she said. It's a provision that hasn't been used in 40 years and using it would be visible. It would look like what it is. But if Malfoy thinks he's running out of options, visible might not be a deterrent. Harry thought about it. If Fudge uses emergency powers to convene a Mars hearing against a Wizengamot member, what are the political consequences? Significant, she said. But not immediately lethal for him. The emergency provision exists, it's technically lawful, and with the right framing he could argue public interest grounds. A pause. What he can't argue is impartiality. But I'm not sure he's worried about impartiality at this point. He's worried about survival, Harry said. If the ethics investigation goes the way it's going and the Sirius Black conviction is posthumously overturned and the registration amendment stays tabled, Fudge's administration is effectively over. He knows that. He looked at her. If Malfoy has convinced him that this is his last option, he'll use it regardless of how it looks. Almost certainly, she said. So I need to make it so that using the emergency provision costs more than not using it, Harry said. Immediately. Today. He thought for a moment. If I call a press session, that's a formal Wizengamot right, she said. As a sovereign holder, you can call a press session to make a public statement about matters affecting your houses. It would need to be announced by the end of business today to be actionable before Monday. Can it be announced in the next 2 hours? Harry asked. She looked at her watch. If you move quickly. He stood up. Then I'll move quickly. The Wizengamot's press briefing room was on level 8, a room that had the comfortable shabbiness of something rarely used, its chairs slightly dusty and its small podium lacking the solemnity of the chamber itself. Harry had never been in it. He suspected few lords had. Press sessions were a technical right that most members either didn't know they had or considered beneath their dignity. Harry thought dignity was substantially less useful than a microphone and an audience. The journalists arrived in stages over the following 45 minutes. Word moved fast in the ministry, and faster still today given the week's events. By the time Harry stepped up to the podium there were 11 reporters in the room, including one he recognized immediately, Rita Skeeter in the front row, quick quotes quill hovering at ready, her expression containing the specific hunger of someone who had already decided this was front page. Thank you for coming, Harry said. No preamble. I'll be brief. He laid out the week's events in sequence, the Wizengamot session, the votes, the ethics complaint. Then he got to the point. Lord Malfoy has made several attempts this week to undermine the legitimate administrative proceedings of the Wizengamot through indirect means, he said. These include an attempt to pressure members to reassign their proxy votes under economic duress, an apparent attempt to interfere with the public record of my inheritance declaration as filed with Gringotts, and most recently a request, declined by Madame Bones, for a Mars disciplinary hearing that would have no legitimate jurisdictional basis. He paused. I want it on the record that I am aware of these attempts. I want it on the record that I have responded to each of them through legal channels. And I want it on the record that if the Minister for Magic uses emergency powers to convene a Mars hearing that his own head of DMLE has declined to authorize, that action will itself be subject to formal review under the Ministry's own conduct provisions. He looked at the room of journalists. Any questions? There were several. He answered them directly and without hedging, which was apparently novel enough that the room had the quality of people recalibrating what a press briefing could be. Skeeter's quick quotes quill was producing text so rapidly it was nearly a blur. He was leaving the building, it was almost 6, the ministry's Friday evening exodus creating its usual organized confusion in the atrium, when he felt his mobile buzz. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words. Message received. LM, Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and kept walking. Ron and Hermione were waiting outside on the street. He showed them the text without comment. Ron read it. He backed off, he said. He acknowledged, Harry said. Different thing. Is it over? Ron asked. The Mars hearing is over, Harry said. Fudge won't use the emergency provision now that it's on public record that Bones declined to sign off. The cost-benefit has shifted. He looked at the ministry building over his shoulder, its imposing facade, its deliberate architecture. Malfoy will find something else. He always does. He paused. But each time he finds something, it costs him something to deploy it. He's spending resources he doesn't have infinite amounts of. And you're not, Hermione said. I'm spending resources too, Harry said honestly. Time. Attention. Political capital with people who might get tired of the noise. He thought about it. But I've got something Malfoy doesn't. What? Ron asked. The thing I'm doing is actually right, Harry said. Which means I don't have to maintain a story. I just have to keep doing the right thing and letting people see it. He started walking toward the apparition point. Malfoy has to maintain a story. That gets exhausting. They operad back to Grimmauld Place separately and reconvened in the kitchen where Creature had, unprompted, made dinner, a proper one, roast chicken and potatoes and something involving gravy that Ron ate with the reverent focus of a person discovering that the world was fundamentally good. After dinner Harry sat in Sirius's study again, in the chair he'd come to think of as his, and read through the week in reverse. The hearing. Ragnarok. The documents. The session. Amelia Bones. Daphne Greengrass. The press briefing. Lucius Malfoy's text. He thought about tomorrow. Hogwarts in the morning. Dumbledore waiting. The anger was the right temperature. He'd been managing it carefully all week, banking it rather than burning it, and it had clarified in the keeping the way certain things did, from diffuse heat into something specific and focused and clean. He wasn't going to Hogwarts to punish Dumbledore. He wasn't going to perform his anger for an audience or reduce Dumbledore to a villain in a story that was easier to navigate if the people in it had simple motivations. Dumbledore was not simple. What he'd done was not simple. And the conversation they needed to have was not going to be simple either. But Harry was going to say what was true. Completely, without softening it out of old habit or gratitude or the weight of what Dumbledore had sacrificed. He was going to say it and then he was going to listen, and then they were going to figure out what came next from that honest ground rather than from the arranged version of their relationship that had been built on managed information and controlled access and the careful sustenance of Harry's dependence on someone who genuinely cared about him and had nonetheless treated him as a means to an end. He picked up the sovereignty ring from where he'd set it on the desk and turned it in his fingers. The seal caught the firelight. 24 houses. Centuries of bloodlines. People who had lived and fought and built things and lost things and loved people who went away and kept building anyway. All of it, somehow, here in a ring on his finger in a house that smelled of old magic in a family he was slowly, without rush, learning to inhabit. He put the ring back on. Downstairs, Ron laughed at something Hermione said. Her answering laugh was more surprised than usual, which meant Ron had actually been funny rather than attempting it, and the sound of it came up through the old floorboards and filled the study and grim old place breathed around him and did not creak. He picked up a quill and started writing, not a letter, not documentation, but notes. His own thoughts about the registration amendment and the detention powers and the reform agenda that he was beginning to shape in his mind. Not policy exactly. Not yet. But the outline of one. The rough shape of what he thought the wizarding world could look like if the people with the power to build it chose to build something worth living in. He wrote until late and went to bed without reading Dumbledore's letter again, because he didn't need to. He'd already decided what he was going to say. Outside, the London night was warm and clear, and somewhere across the city in a building with a polished surface and certain very old depths, a goblin archive recorded, in permanent, unalterable ink, by the light of a lamp that had been burning for 3 centuries, that the House of Selwyn was and had always been legitimately claimed, and that the record was complete and correct and could not be changed by anyone at any price. The night passed quietly. In Wiltshire, Lucius Malfoy sat alone and did not sleep, and looked at his notes, and drew a new line between the 2nd note and the 6th. He was not done. But for the first time in a long time, he was not certain. Chapter 6, The World Reorganizes Itself. Hogwarts in July was a different school entirely. Without the students it became something older, the castle's actual age visible in its empty corridors, the silence between its stones, the silence of 8 centuries of accumulated time rather than the pause between one period of noise and the next. The suits of armor stood at their posts with more dignity than usual. The portraits dozed. The grand staircase shifted through its configurations with the unhurried creativity of something that moved for its own satisfaction rather than to confuse a crowd of children. Harry arrived by the Hogsmeade apparition point at 8 in the morning and walked up alone through the grounds, through the familiar summer smell of the lake and the grass and the castle's particular mixture of old stone and magic and something he'd never been able to identify that he'd come to associate simply with the word home. The word sat differently on him now than it had the first time he'd walked up this path at 11 years old. Not less true. Just more complicated, the way all true things got when you'd lived with them long enough to understand them properly. The doors opened before he reached them. He didn't know if that was Dumbledore or the castle itself. He suspected the latter. The corridors were cool and dim. His footsteps echoed. He didn't need to think about where he was going. His feet knew the route to Dumbledore's office the way they knew certain paths in Grimmauld Place now, through repetition and the particular muscle memory of significant journeys taken multiple times. The gargoyle at the base of the moving staircase was already open. He went up. He knocked once and pushed the door open without waiting. Dumbledore was at his desk. Not performing a task, not writing or reading, just sitting, with his hands folded in front of him and his half-moon spectacles on his nose and the specific quality of stillness that very old people sometimes had, as if they'd learned to rest completely because they understood that the energy was finite and the demands were not. He looked older than Harry had expected. It was the first thing Harry noticed and the one he noticed most sharply. The war had aged everyone, but it had aged Dumbledore in a particular way, not weakened him, but carved something into him, the way pressure carves stone. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was still carrying it and had decided, at some point, to stop pretending it was light. "Harry," he said. "Not Lord Potter. Not my boy," which Harry had always found both touching and faintly presumptuous. Just his name, quietly, with something in it that was either grief or relief or both. "Professor," Harry said. He sat down in the chair across the desk, the same chair he'd sat in for detentions and revelations and plans that were never fully shared, and he looked at Dumbledore directly and let the silence be what it was. "I've read the Ethics Committee complaint," Dumbledore said. "And the Gringotts documentation. And the Prophet." A pause. "I've been reading a great deal this week." "So have I," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him over the half-moon spectacles with the eyes that had always been too sharp to hide behind their outward warmth. "You want to know why," he said. "I know why," Harry said. "Gringotts gave me access to the sealed notes from your guardianship records. The rationale is documented." He paused. "What I want to know is whether you believe it. Still. Whether you'd make the same decisions today." That landed differently than Dumbledore had expected. Harry could see the adjustment, the slight recalibration of a man who had prepared for one kind of confrontation and was receiving another. "What I believe," Dumbledore said carefully, "is more complicated than yes or no." "Then give me the complicated version," Harry said. "I'm not 17 in the way you thought I was 17. I can follow a complicated argument." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the ground stretched green and empty in the morning light. Fawkes was on his perch in the corner. He made no sound, just watched with those ancient liquid eyes. "When you were born," Dumbledore said, "the prophecy had already been made. I knew what it meant, or thought I knew, which is a different thing, though I conflated the two for longer than I should have. I believed that the child in the prophecy would need to be prepared for what was coming in a very specific way. Not just magically. Psychologically." He looked at his folded hands. "I believed that a child raised to wealth and status and the knowledge of his own power would develop the kind of pride that made heroes into tragic figures. I had seen it before. I had contributed to it before, in certain ways, with certain people." A pause that carried weight. Tom Riddle was brilliant and exceptional, and he knew it by the time he was 12. "I have spent 70 years wondering what would have been different if he hadn't." "I'm not Tom Riddle," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said. "You are not. And that is something I understood too late, that the quality in you that I was trying to protect through privation was not created by privation at all. It was inherent. You were never going to become Tom Riddle regardless of what you knew about yourself." He looked up. "By the time I understood that clearly, you were 14, and changing course carried its own risks, and I told myself that the remaining decisions were already made and that disrupting them would cause more harm than leaving them in place." He paused. "That was rationalization. I am aware of that. The block on my magic," Harry said. "When I was 13. Dumbledore didn't look away. "Yes. You blocked my magic," Harry said. The flat certainty of it in his own voice. Because I destroyed a basilisk at 12 and you thought I was developing too fast. I was afraid, Dumbledore said. Not of you, I want to be precise. I was afraid of what the world would do with you if you arrived at your full capability before the war was finished. Voldemort was not yet returned. The ministry was unstable. There are individuals in the wizarding world who would have seen a 13-year-old of your power and moved to acquire that power for their own purposes. He paused. I told myself I was protecting you. You were protecting your plan, Harry said. It's not the same thing. The words landed. Dumbledore absorbed them without flinching, which Harry gave him credit for. Yes, he said. In part. Both things were true simultaneously, and I allowed the second to be justified by the first more than I should have. The money, Harry said. I used it, Dumbledore said, without hedging. To fund the order. To maintain the safe houses. To support individuals who needed resources to fight and had none. He paused. I told myself that it was what your parents would have wanted, that James and Lily's resources being used to fight the war they died fighting was appropriate. A pause. I did not ask. I should have asked, even if asking meant explaining to an 11-year-old boy things I had decided he was not ready to hear. The decision was mine and the justification was mine and I made it unilaterally and that was wrong. The proxy votes, Harry said. Assigned to individuals I trusted, Dumbledore said. People I believed would vote in alignment with what I considered to be the interests of the wizarding world's long-term stability. He paused. Again, not asking. Not consulting. Acting as if your authority was something I held in trust to be managed rather than something that belonged to you. He looked at Harry with the careful directness of someone who had been thinking about exactly this moment and had decided to meet it honestly rather than strategically. There is a pattern in all of it, Harry. I have been aware of the pattern for some time. Naming it out loud to you is not comfortable, but it is correct, and you deserve correct over comfortable. Harry sat with that for a moment. He'd come here with the middle temperature anger and it was still there, he could feel it, specific and present. But sitting across from Dumbledore and watching the man genuinely account for what he'd done without deflecting it or dressing it in more palatable language, Harry felt something else too. Something that was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but was the recognition of a human being doing the difficult thing. Doing it badly, for years, for reasons that were not simple. And then sitting in a chair and saying so. I'm going to file a formal complaint to the Wizengamot Ethics Committee, Harry said. About the guardianship. About the block. About the proxy assignments and the vault withdrawals. It's going to be on the record. I know, Dumbledore said. I'm not doing it to destroy you, Harry said. I'm doing it because what happened to me was wrong and because if it happened to me it's happened to other children and the mechanism that allowed it to happen needs to be examined and changed. He paused. The record needs to exist. Future children who are placed in magical guardianship situations need the protection of knowing that the record exists and that it matters. That is a better reason than I deserve, Dumbledore said quietly. It's not about what you deserve, Harry said. It's about what needs to happen. He leaned forward slightly. What I want to know from you, and this is the part one actually came here to hear, because I could have filed the complaint without coming, is what you know about Voldemort that you haven't told me. Not the Horcruxes, we've covered most of that. Specifically about the seventh one. The shift in Dumbledore's expression was very small and very telling. You know, Harry said. I have a theory, Dumbledore said carefully. Tell me the theory. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for the pensieve. It was on the desk rather than the cabinet, Harry noticed, as if it had been placed there in preparation, and said, this may be easier to show than to tell. No, Harry said. Dumbledore looked up. Tell me, Harry said. In words, in this room, directly. No pensieve, no memories, no carefully curated experience. Tell me what you think, and then I'll ask questions, and you'll answer them. He held Dumbledore's gaze. I'm done receiving information in the format you've chosen for me. I want to be in the conversation. Something moved across Dumbledore's face that was complicated and genuine and might, under different circumstances, have been called pride. He set the pensive aside. And then he told Harry. Directly, in words, without the softening of metaphor or the controlled revelation of the pensive experience. He told him about the seventh Horcrux. What he believed it was. What it would mean. What he thought needed to happen and when and why. Harry listened. He asked questions. Dumbledore answered them. Some of the answers were incomplete, Dumbledore said so when they were, which was different from before when the incompleteness had been dressed as sufficient, as if the portion he was given was the whole meal. Some of the answers were deeply uncomfortable, the kind that sat in the stomach rather than the head. When they were done, Harry sat for a while looking at the desk. You were going to let me walk into it without knowing, Harry said. Not an accusation. Just a fact. Yes, Dumbledore said. I believed that knowing would prevent you from doing what needed to be done. You were wrong, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I would have done it anyway, Harry said. If it's what it takes, I would have done it anyway. You should have told me. You should have trusted me to be brave enough to choose it. He paused. That's what you never understood about me. You never needed to engineer my courage. I was always going to choose the right thing. You just needed to let me choose it. The room was very quiet. Fawkes made a small sound on his perch, not a song, just a note, singular and clear, and then silence again. No, Dumbledore said, and his voice was very low. I don't believe I did understand that. Not fully. I understood your bravery. I didn't understand, I didn't trust, that bravery and knowledge together would produce the same outcome as bravery and ignorance. He looked at Harry over his spectacles. I thought I needed to protect the outcome. I didn't trust the person. And now? Harry asked. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Now I trust the person, he said. Completely. And I am aware that this trust arrives approximately 6 years too late to be useful as anything other than a statement. It's useful, Harry said. It's useful because it means you'll cooperate. With the inquiry. With whatever the ethics committee finds. With the changes that need to happen to guardianship provisions and ministry oversight. He paused. And because I need your knowledge. I'm not going to fight this war at arm's length from the person who understands it most deeply, just because that person made decisions I didn't consent to. But it changes. The way we work changes. You tell me things. All of it. No sequencing, no curated revelations. Everything you know, when I ask for it. Dumbledore nodded. Everything, he said. I mean it, Harry said. I know you do, Dumbledore said. That's rather the point. Harry stood up. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped, because there was one more thing and he'd known it was there since he sat down and he'd been circling it because it was the hardest one, not the anger, not the accountability, but the other thing underneath all of it. I don't hate you, he said, without turning around. I want to be clear about that. What you did was wrong and it needs to be on the record and there are real consequences attached to it that I'm not going to soften. But I don't hate you. He paused. You fought for this world for 70 years. You made impossible decisions under impossible pressure and some of them were right and some of them were wrong and you're still here making them. He turned. That matters. I'm not pretending it doesn't. Dumbledore was looking at him with the eyes that were too sharp for their outward warmth, and for once the warmth and the sharpness were the same thing, not layered or alternating but simultaneous. Thank you, Harry, he said. Simply. Harry nodded once and went out, and the door closed quietly behind him. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he walked back through Hogwarts, through its summer quiet, through the corridors that knew his footsteps and the staircase that let him pass without shifting and the doors that opened a second before he reached them. Outside the grounds were bright and warm and the lake was completely still. He sat on the grass near the shore for a while, alone, and let the conversation settle through him. The anger was still there, changed slightly in quality, not resolved, not gone, but having found its accurate home. Not a fire to be banked. Just a fact, specific and permanent, about something that had happened to him and that he was choosing to carry without being carried by it. His mobile buzzed. "Ron, how'd it go?" Harry typed back, honestly. "It went honestly." A pause. Then, "Good or bad?" Honest. Harry looked at the lake. A squid tentacle broke the surface briefly and disappeared. "Both. Come to Grimmauld Place. We've got work to do." He operated from the edge of the grounds and arrived back at Grimmauld Place to find not just Ron and Hermione but also, somewhat unexpectedly, a kitchen that contained Bill Weasley, Augusta Longbottom, Daphne Greengrass, and Amelia Bones. He stood in the doorway and looked at this gathering. "Hermione organized it," Ron said, from his usual chair, with the tone of a man who had learned that when Hermione organized something it was best to simply observe the results. "We have things to discuss," Hermione said, without looking up from the table, which was covered in a quantity of parchment that had migrated significantly since this morning. "The ethics complaint is formally accepted and Millicent Bagnold sent a preliminary response that has implications for the timeline. The Sirius Black posthumous review has been fast-tracked by 3 weeks because 2 additional members of the Wizengamot filed supporting petitions this morning. Augusta brought those." She looked up. "And Lucius Malfoy has formally resigned from the Wizengamot." The kitchen was very quiet. "Resigned," Harry said. "This morning," Amelia Bones said. She had the tone of someone reporting a fact they had independently verified several times. "Effective immediately. No public statement." The resignation was filed with the Administration Services Office at 9:47 and accepted pro forma. Harry pulled out a chair and sat down. He saw the ethics complaint, he said. And the Greengrass statement. He thought about it. And the press session. And Bones not signing the Mars authorization. He laid it out sequentially. He ran the numbers and decided that staying in the Wizengamot during an active ethics investigation was a worse position than removing himself from the jurisdiction. Removing himself from the jurisdiction doesn't remove him from the investigation, Bones said. No, Harry said. But it buys him time and limits his public exposure. He paused. He's not gone. He'll work from behind other people now. He looked at the room. We need to make sure the investigation can reach him regardless of his seat status. It can, Bones said. The complaint was filed before the resignation. The Ethics Committee's jurisdiction attaches at filing, not at current seat status. Bagnold confirmed it. Harry nodded. He looked around the table, Bill Weasley with his curse-breaking expertise and his Gringotts connections, Augusta Longbottom with her 40 years of Wizengamot knowledge and her willingness to use it, Daphne Greengrass with her sharp eyes and her pragmatic intelligence, Amelia Bones with her institutional authority and her demonstrated willingness to put it where it was needed, Ron with his strategic mind and his complete, uncomplicated loyalty, Hermione with everything she always was. All right, he said. Tell me everything. They worked through the afternoon. The ethics investigation timeline, the Sirius Black review, the composition of the independent panel for the registration amendment review. Harry wanted the panel constituted before the next Wizengamot session so that the tabling motion couldn't be reversed on grounds of delay. The guardianship inquiry, which was the most complicated piece legally, because it touched not just Dumbledore but the broader framework of magical guardianship law, which had significant gaps that needed filling and which Hermione had already drafted preliminary recommendations for. Augusta Longbottom took the draft recommendations and read through them with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what could be moved through the Wizengamot and what couldn't. She made 4 annotations in the margin in sharp decisive strokes. These 3 provisions will pass, she said, tapping each one. This 4th one, the independent audit mechanism, will face resistance because it limits ministerial discretion in appointment of guardians. We'll need to frame it differently. How differently? Hermione asked. Not as a limit on discretion, Augusta said. As a protection for the ministry. If an independent audit exists, the ministry cannot be blamed for the conduct of guardians who pass the audit. She paused. Give people a way to vote for the right thing by making it also the self-interested thing. That's how the Wizengamot has always moved. That's deeply cynical, Hermione said. That's deeply accurate, Augusta said. You'll understand the distinction better in about 20 years. Hermione wrote down the reframing without argument, which was its own kind of growth. Bill Weasley, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon with the particular quietness of someone who processes through listening, said, Gringotts wants to propose a joint oversight committee. Goblin and Wizarding representatives. For inheritance management in cases of minority. He looked at Harry. Ragnarok asked me to bring it up. He didn't want to push it while you were dealing with other things, but he wanted you to know it was on the table. Tell Ragnarok yes, Harry said. Work with him on the composition. I want goblin representatives who have full standing, not advisory roles. If we're doing oversight it needs to have teeth. Bill nodded. He had, Harry noticed, the look of someone who had been hoping for exactly that answer and was quietly pleased. He'll be very happy to hear that, Bill said. Good, Harry said. He's earned it. Daphne Greengrass had not said much since the afternoon began, but she'd been present in the particular way of someone who was absorbing everything and filing it accurately. As the afternoon moved toward evening she said, the registration amendment panel. You'll need someone from the non-human magical community on it. Not as a token. As a full voting member with the same standing as the wizarding members. Harry looked at her. Do you have someone in mind? Several, she said. I've been in contact with representatives from the Centaur community and the Merperson community. Both are willing to engage if the terms of engagement are genuinely equal. She paused. They've been promised equal terms before. I know, Harry said. This time I'm offering it under sovereignty seal. Which means if the terms aren't honored, there's a formal mechanism for redress that doesn't depend on the ministry's goodwill. He paused. Tell them that. Specifically. She nodded. Something in her face that had been carefully composed all afternoon relaxed by a small but genuine degree. By 7 in the evening they had a working document, not final, not complete, but a comprehensive draft of what Harry was going to present at the next Wizengamot session in 2 weeks. 3 separate legislative proposals, the panel composition, the guardianship reform recommendations, and a formal motion for a full inquiry into the ministry's conduct in the period between Voldemort's first fall and his confirmed return. That last one was the most politically dangerous and the most necessary. He'd known since the beginning that it needed to happen. Getting the Wizengamot to vote for an inquiry into itself required either moral courage that most politicians didn't have or enough external pressure that voting against it was riskier than voting for it. He was going to apply enough external pressure that voting against it was riskier than voting for it. The press session is already doing some of that work, Hermione said. Skeeter has been filing stories every day this week. The narrative is established. People understand that things were done that shouldn't have been done. I want the Hogwarts angle covered, Harry said. Specifically, the Umbridge year. What she did to students, what she did to the school, with full ministry authorization. He looked at Amelia Bones. You have the authority to initiate a formal investigation into the conduct of ministry-appointed officials, don't you? Within the DMLE's remit, yes, she said. Umbridge's appointment as Hogwarts High Inquisitor was a ministry appointment, he said. Her conduct during that appointment, the educational decrees, the disciplinary practices, the attempted use of Veritaserum on a student, he watched Bones's expression and saw the precise moment she connected the implication. That's within your remit. It is, she said, in the tone of someone who had just found something they'd been looking for in a place they hadn't thought to check. Yes. It is. Good, Harry said. Move on it early next week, before the Wizengamot session. The timing matters. Ron looked between Harry and Amelia Bones with the focused attention he usually reserved for chess mid-game. You're sequencing it, he said. Each thing creates the context for the next thing. Everything that comes out about Umbridge makes the case for the broader Ministry inquiry, Harry said. Everything the broader inquiry finds makes the case for the guardianship reform. Everything the guardianship reform establishes makes it harder to do to the next child what was done to me. He looked at the table. It's connected. It all needs to be connected. Because the Wizengamot in isolation will swallow anything you can throw at it and call it exceptional circumstances. But if the picture is complete and they have to look at the whole thing at once, they can't pretend it's exceptional, Augusta said. They have to acknowledge it's systemic. Yes, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment with those sharp black eyes and the expression that was not warm exactly but was something closely adjacent to respect. You've been thinking about this longer than the last week, she said. I've been living it longer than the last week, he said. The kitchen held that for a moment. Then Bill said, I'm going to owl Ragnarok tonight before he goes home. If goblins go home, do goblins go home? I genuinely don't know, Harry said. I'll owl him anyway, Bill said. People began gathering their things in the gradual way of a meeting that had run its course naturally and productively. Augusta rolled up her annotated draft and tucked it under her arm with the efficiency of someone who had been managing important documents for decades. Daphne gathered her notes with the precision that Harry was coming to identify as characteristic. Bill headed for the floor with the comfortable ease of someone who moved between institutions regularly and was used to exits. Amelia Bones paused at the kitchen door. She looked back at Harry with the direct gray gaze that had been consistently readable throughout the week, honest and careful and choosing its moments. For what it's worth, she said, I've been in this ministry for 30 years. I have watched many people come through it with power. Some who deserved it. Some who didn't. Some who deserved it and lost it to people who didn't. She paused. I haven't before seen someone walk into a room where the system had been arranged to diminish them and come out having made the system answer for itself. Another pause. It's worth something. I thought you should know. She left before he had to figure out what to say to that, which he thought was probably deliberate and very much in keeping with her. The kitchen was just the three of them after that, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Creature moving around the periphery doing kitchen things that involved considerably more care than the situation technically required. The table was covered in papers and empty teacups and the detritus of 6 hours of serious work, and it felt, Harry thought, like exactly the right kind of room. The kind of room where things actually happened. Malfoy's still out there, Ron said. He wasn't being negative, he was being accurate, which was a thing Ron did that people mistook for pessimism. He is, Harry said. He'll regroup, Ron said. Find a different angle. Different people. He's got resources we can't see. I know, Harry said. Doesn't scare you? Ron asked. Harry thought about it. No, he said honestly. It would have, before. Before this week, I think it did, the idea of Malfoy operating from the shadows, moving things I couldn't see. But, he paused, looking for the right articulation. Whatever he does, he's doing it in a world where 31 seats of the Wizengamot are mine and the Ethics Committee has an active investigation and Amelia Bones has authorized an inquiry into Umbridge and Ragnarok is building a joint oversight committee. He looked at his hand, the ring catching the kitchen light. The ground is different. Whatever move he makes, he's making it on different ground than last week. And the week after that the ground will be different again. He paused. I'm not trying to stop him from making moves. I'm trying to make each move he makes less effective than the last one. Attrition, Hermione said. Something like that, Harry said. Except it's not just about wearing him down. It's about building something. Something that exists regardless of whether Malfoy is maneuvering against it, because it's based on things that are actually true, legal, documented, sealed, publicly recorded things. He can maneuver against political will. He can't maneuver against a goblin seal. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you get this smart? I've always been smart, Harry said. I was just spending it all on surviving. Ron laughed. Hermione smiled, the real one, the small one, and looked back at her notes with the affection of someone who had found the right problem to dedicate herself to. Harry stood up and stretched and walked to the window of the Grimmauld Place kitchen and looked out at the square. Empty now, in the evening. Nobody walking past. The London sky above the rooftops was that particular summer evening blue, still light at the edges, darkening at the center, the kind of sky that felt like it contained more space than it geometrically should. He thought about what came next. Not strategically, just personally. What did it feel like to be this person, in this moment, with the week that had just happened sitting behind him and the weeks ahead containing more of the same work but also, somewhere in there, a war that was still coming and would require different things from him than the Wizengamot required. It felt, he decided, like being exactly the size he actually was. Not inflated by circumstance or reputation. Not compressed by design or management. Just his actual size, in his actual world, with his actual capabilities and his actual friends and the actual work in front of him. He hadn't known, before this week, how much of his energy had been spent simply maintaining the compressed version. How much effort it took to be smaller than you were, year after year, to avoid the people who found your size threatening and to accommodate the people who needed you manageable. He'd done it so long it had felt like his own choice, like that was just who he was. It wasn't who he was. It was what had been done to him, and the distinction mattered, and it was done now. What are you thinking about? Hermione asked, without looking up. How much work there is, Harry said. Too much, she asked. No, he said. Just, a lot. In a way that's good. In a way where the work matters. He turned back from the window. We're going to need more people. I've been making a list, Hermione said. Of course you have, Ron said. Do you want to see it? She asked Harry. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight I want to, just sit in this for a bit. Is that all right? She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's all right. Creature made dinner again. This time he outdid himself entirely, 3 courses, which none of them had asked for, delivered to the table with the gravity of a being who had decided that this household deserved proper meals and was not going to be talked out of it. Ron ate with unself-conscious delight. Hermione ate while reading, which was her version of relaxation. Harry ate and talked and listened and didn't think about anything except the room and the people in it and the food in front of him, because this was also something he'd been practicing, being present in the good moments rather than spending them on the next problem. After dinner they sat in the sitting room, a room that had been genuinely gloomy when Harry first reclaimed Grimmauld Place and had been incrementally improved over the week's residency, with the windows opened and some of the darker portraits temporarily relocated and a fire going despite the summer warmth because the sitting room was one of those rooms that wanted a fire in it regardless of season. Ron fell asleep in his chair again. Earlier than last time. He snored very slightly. He's been up since 5 every morning this week, Hermione said, quietly enough not to wake him. So have you, Harry said. I handle it differently, she said. Which was true. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, the fire moving, the house breathing, London doing its evening things around them. Do you think it works? Hermione asked, eventually. What we've started. Do you think it actually changes things? Harry looked at the fire. I think the registration amendment is tabled, he said. I think Sirius gets his name cleared. I think the kids who come after us through magical guardianship situations have more protection than I had. He paused. I think Malfoy is going to have a very difficult several months. I think Fudge's administration is effectively finished even if he doesn't know it yet. He paused again. I think the bigger things, Voldemort, the Horcruxes, what Dumbledore told me this morning, that's still coming. And it's going to be hard in ways that none of this was hard. He looked at her. But we're going into it differently than we would have. We're going into it with standing. With resources. With allies who have actual institutional authority. He looked at the ring on his hand. With knowledge of what we're actually dealing with, rather than the knowledge we were allowed to have. She nodded slowly. That does change it, she said. Yeah, he said. It changes it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Harry. For what it's worth, this week. Watching you. She seemed to be selecting words with more care than usual, which for Hermione was saying something. You didn't become someone different. You became more completely who you already were. And it was, she stopped. Started again. It was good to watch. That's all. Harry looked at her. She was looking at the fire with the expression of someone who had said the thing they meant to say and was now giving it space to exist without adding to it. Thank you, he said. Ron snored softly in his chair. Grimmauld Place breathed around them, warm and quiet and occupied, fully for the first time perhaps since it had last held people who loved it. Outside the square was empty and the London sky was fully dark now, clear and full of stars that were very hard to see from here because the city was bright but were there nonetheless, doing their ancient patient work of existing. Harry sat in the firelight and thought about his parents, James and Lily in their living room in Godric's Hollow, the rituals flash of them, alive and unaware and so completely themselves. He thought about Sirius's letter, "Don't you dare apologize for being powerful." He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't managing his size downward to fit someone else's architecture of who he was supposed to be. He was Harry Potter. He was the sovereign lord of 24 noble and most ancient houses. He was going to fight a war and do his work in the Wizengamot and hold his friends close and have Creature make breakfast in the mornings and sit in this chair in this firelight in this house that was his and had been waiting for him. He was going to be exactly the size he actually was, every day, from now on. The fire burned low. He didn't add to it. Just let it burn down at its own pace, comfortable in the dark that came after, and the house didn't creak, and the ring sat warm on his hand, and the world, reorganized, unsettled, different in its foundations, continued to turn. Tomorrow there would be more work. Tonight this was enough.